The girl shuddered when she took a call from a client. The man was furious because he could not understand how they could sell such a product. He asked if she really wanted him to sue them. The girl was furious she needed to calm down an unhappy client. She asked if he could explain in detail what exactly had upset him, and he asked angrily if she couldn't understand human speech. The girl yawned very sweetly as she really wanted to sleep again. She thought that she should have gone to bed earlier instead of reading a novel with her eyes closed. She thought that when she got home, she would go to bed right away. When she opened her eyes, a crowd of unfamiliar people appeared in front of her. The man looked at Eden intently and with a smirk told him to tell him what he did wrong. The young lady in turn was very puzzled. She did not understand what was happening and where she was. She heard the men talking and froze in place as they were talking about the fact that the man could be hanged if he did not answer. The men whispered quietly because they were afraid of the emperor. They did not know who would dare to stop him. A moment later, the emperor looked at the man with a grin and threw a dagger at him. Eden froze, standing against the wall, and at the same time a trickle of blood flowed down his neck. The emperor looked at the man with a grin and said that there were only 3 daggers left. The man told the emperor that he had made a mistake. He trembled and looked at the emperor and said that he dared to interfere in the bet. The young man froze in shock as he saw another dagger being aimed at him again. The young lady stood and listened to the conversation of the men who said that if Eden valued his life, then there was no point in interfering. They knew that he had ordered the losing team to pay for the drinks, and if anyone tried to cover the costs with a night's pay, it would end in disgrace. The young lady was in shock. She did not understand why all this seemed so familiar to her. A moment later, the emperor pointed a dagger at her. He looked at the young lady with his eyes and said that she should answer him. She froze in shock, looking at the emperor. He looked at her and asked with a smirk what Eden had done wrong. She saw daggers, booze money, and a knight named Eden. She realized that it was in the novel she had read the night before. She was shocked and told herself that it was simply impossible, but at the same time she wondered if she had really gotten into a novel. She was a call center employee with many years of experience. Unfortunately, her emotions were dulled by the harsh words of clients. Romantic stories were the only joy in life. The events unfolded around the princess who was considered the emperor's concubine. At the climax, a rebellion breaks out, and the imperial palace cannot withstand the onslaught. The main character commits suicide right in front of the princess. The princess in turn was in shock. She screamed for him to stop. The story ended on a sad note. The main character goes crazy. She understood that if she ended up in this novel, then the man in front of her was the main character of the novel. Cardin Zeon, ruler of the Empire of Hisronia. He had black hair and red eyes, a straight nose and a pointed chin. The emperor's appearance was compared to a sculpture created by a great artist. The emperor was a tyrant who indulged in pleasure and mercilessly punished all who went against him. He was a womanizer, constantly surrounded by women. He was as terrible as he was beautiful. She was puzzled because she had criticized him when she read the novel because he was trash. The emperor looked at her with fury and asked if she was really thinking about something else right now. She was shocked, looking at the emperor, wondering what she should say. She looked at him and knew only one thing. If he did not get the answer he wanted, she could die. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that he was right. She knew that clients who continued to insist on their innocence simply wanted to be told they were right. She said that in order to win at polo, he dared to thwart the emperor by resorting to unfair play. She shouted that this was simply treason on his part. She knew that in this situation the emperor was right since he had a knife in his hand. The emperor looked at her intently and asked with a grin if this was really so. He threw the dagger with lightning speed and said, looking at the young lady, that only she understood him. The emperor looked at her intently and said that the knight deserved to die. The young lady froze. She knew that he was completely different from the people she interacted with every day. She understood that one word from her and the knight could really die. She knew that she had to think everything through carefully. She told the emperor that the knight had committed a crime and that he might experience pain before being punished. She said that the knight dared to take victory away from the emperor, and he should be demoted from the commander of the knights to a lowly guard. She said that the knight would lose the position of commander for which he had worked all his life, and that it would be worse than death. The emperor said that it was a great idea, and that they would do just that, and the young lady was very glad that everything ended well. He looked at everyone present and said puzzled that it was unpleasant for him to see blood so early in the morning. Everyone present froze in shock, and one man asked the emperor if they should invite dancers from the south. The emperor sighed heavily and said that there was no need for that. The man asked if he should invite a masseuse. The emperor refused. The man asked for forgiveness and said that he could not invite anyone else now. The emperor looked at the young lady with a grin and asked if there wasn't such a person right in front of him. She looked at him in bewilderment. She understood that she didn't know who he was talking about, but the man was clearly unlucky. Everyone looked intently at the young lady, who in turn froze in shock. The young lady was shocked and could not utter a word. The emperor looked intently at Duchess Erin Walloa called her. Looking at the Duchess, he said with a grin that it was she. The Duchess was shocked. She wondered she didn't understand why he was doing this to her. She knew that she would never get involved with such trash. She was afraid that knives might be thrown at her. The Duchess looked puzzled and said that she was very honored, but she was not sure she could satisfy him. He looked at her with fury, but in an instant he changed and said with a grin that she was very excited. A moment later, the emperor said that this was the end of their meeting, and they all hurried out of the hall. The young lady in turn was very glad that she had survived, and she was proud of herself. She was in shock and did not understand why she took over someone's body during the meeting. She knew that in other stories, people opened their eyes reborn while lying in their bed. She froze when she remembered that the emperor had called her Duchess. A moment later, she was stunned as she realized what had entered the Duchess of Walloa's body. The Duchess was a villain who rarely appeared in the novel. She often calmed the emperor down, even though they argued. She understood that, in essence, they were similar. This story made a great impression on her, and the emperor ordered a greenhouse to be built for the main character. At the same time, the Duchess asked him to solve the financial difficulties of the order, and she was immediately executed after that. She was in shock and did not understand why she was lucky to be in the body of a character who would soon die. The young lady was puzzled by everything that was happening. She simply could not believe that she could soon die. She knew that the emperor and the Duchess rarely met on business, but she did not understand why he said such words to her at the meeting. She wondered if there was some plot line she didn't know about. She knew she didn't have enough information. The young lady in turn understood that she must first see with her own eyes what kind of world this was. The young lady wanted to take a walk around the palace grounds. She wanted to learn more about the world of the novel. The Duchess stood frozen in place as the beauty of the palace amazed her. But a moment later, she saw a knight being led by guards. She looked at him intently because she recognized him and she felt sorry for him. A moment later, the knights noticed the Duchess and bowed to her with all courtesy. She was surprised. The young lady glared at the knight as it was because of her that he was removed from his position as the commander of the knights. She knew it was inevitable, but she felt guilty towards him. He looked at the Duchess intently and thanked her. He said that if it were not for her, he would have lost his life. He said with a beaming smile that he was indebted to the Duchess. She knew that the position to which he had dedicated his entire life had been taken away, but she saw no disappointment, only gratitude. She was furious because she knew that if the tyrant didn't like something, he would start killing people. The Duchess looked closely at the young man's wounds. A moment later, she looked at the knight and said that if he needed anything, he could contact her. Eden was surprised but still very pleased. He thanked her for her concern. She stared after him as she didn't think that this character would disappear after one appearance. A moment later, a maid ran up to her and shouted. The Duchess looked at her in surprise. A moment later, she remembered that the maid had addressed her in this way and was taken aback, for she had forgotten that she was now a duchess. The maid told the Duchess that they had to hurry because they had to prepare an outfit for dinner. The Duchess asked what dinner they were talking about. The maid asked if she herself had not asked for a suitable outfit to be prepared for a meal with the emperor. The maid said that King Taraki and his second wife would also be present at the dinner. The young lady was shocked. She was puzzled because just a couple of hours ago, she was an ordinary employee of the center, and now she was going to a diplomatic dinner. The maid asked the Duchess in confusion if something was wrong. The Duchess laughed and said that there was no problem. She understood that now she had no time to admire the palace since the diplomatic dinner was approaching. The Duchess asked when dinner would take place. The maid said it was still half a day away, and she had already prepared all the clothes. The duchess sighed heavily and said that it was very good that there was still time. The maid trembled with fear. The young lady looked closely at the maid and asked with a smile if she would show her to the office. She understood that even if luck was on her side this time, there was no guarantee that it would continue like this. She had no idea what was going on in the world, and in order to survive, she needed to get her thoughts in order and figure out her responsibilities. She understood that if she found out everything in advance, she would have a chance to avoid death. She sat and studied the documents intently, but a moment later she froze in shock. The duchess was shocked because she saw from the documents that the imperial family had almost no money left. She was sure that she would die just like the duchess, since the treasury was empty. She knew that if the emperor went mad and ordered another villa to be built, she would die faster than the duchess in the original story. Call center experience was useless here. She wondered with fury if she would become a clumsy traitor. She knew that if she survived and somehow filled the treasury, she would save up money and run off into the sunset before the empire fell. She knew she had to put her doubts aside to fulfill the tyrant's dreams and become a rare traitor. The king told the emperor that he and his wife had asked him for a personal meeting. He did not understand why the duchess was also present. The duchess looked at them intently and said that if she were not there, no one would be able to taste the emperor's food. The emperor froze in indignation as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The king and queen looked at the duchess in surprise and bewilderment. But the duchess in turn smiled radiantly at them. She looked at the king intently. She did not understand what kind of reaction he was having. She wondered if it was too suspicious. She was no better than Carden's dog now. She looked at the king intently and asked if he meant to say that everything would be all right if the emperor poisoned himself. The king was shocked and shouted that he didn't mean it that way. The duchess said with a smile that of course they understood him and that he didn't mean it that way. She was very sorry. She knew she had to be more shameless. Bowing, she said she was being sincere. She asked the emperor if he would allow her to try his food so that she could prove her loyalty. The emperor, in turn, looked with fury at the duchess since she spoke of loyalty. He looked at her with fury and said that she could begin. A moment later, he said with a grin that poisoned food could cause indigestion and warned her to be careful. She looked at him with a smile as she remembered some information about him. The emperor became a master of the sword and made a name for himself in the War of Conquest when he was a prince. She hoped that the emperor would not have indigestion since, after that, she would have to flee the empire with lightning speed. After the duchess had tasted a piece of the emperor's dish, she looked at the king and queen who were looking at her in horror. She told the emperor with a smile that everything was fine and he could begin his meal, but at the same time she was trembling with fear. The emperor said with a smile that she had done a good job. She was puzzled because she had put her life on the line. She knew that no one would poison a swordmaster who was not affected by any poison, and the food was not poisoned. The duchess politely said that it was a great honor for her to take part in the tasting of the emperor's dish. The emperor looked at her with fury and asked if he could now enjoy his meal in peace. The emperor looked at those present with a knife in his hand. Everyone froze, looking at the emperor in fear. He looked at the duchess intently and said with a grin that cutting the steak really irritated him. She understood that if she did not give the tyrant what he wanted, then she would be in trouble. She took the plate from the king with lightning speed. With tears in her eyes, she mentally asked for forgiveness for her actions. The emperor looked at those present with a grin and said that the steak was well cut, and now he could begin his meal. The emperor said that he was still a little hot. The duchess took the queen's fan from her with lightning speed. A moment later, the duchess approached the emperor and shouted that the windows should be opened so that the emperor would not be hot. The queen was shocked because she did not understand what was happening at all. But the duchess in turn stood with the most imperturbable expression and smiled, waving her fan near the emperor. She looked at the emperor with a smile and asked what he would say. She was interested in whether he was feeling better. The emperor said that the fan gave off an unpleasant smell of perfume. He looked at her and told her to stop waving it. A moment later, the duchess, with the speed of lightning, threw the fan out of the window. She knew that simply stopping fanning was not enough, and that she had to remove everything that irritated the emperor. The queen was shocked and looked at the fan with puzzlement as it was her mother's fan. The duchess froze in shock as she realized she had made a grave mistake. The emperor looked sideways at the duchess and said that the statue was in the way. The duchess said that she understood everything and would now move it. She understood that she had made many mistakes, and if she did nothing, she would be executed. The emperor looked at the duchess and told her to leave the statue in place. The emperor said that the statue was pleasant to look at as it matched the interior of the hall, but he wanted the statue's head to not shine so much. She felt very guilty for her actions, but she knew that nothing could be done, so she slowly approached the king. The dukes did not know that she had no other choice. The king and queen were shocked by her actions. She slowly walked towards the statue. A moment later, the king's beautiful wig was visible on the statue's head. The king in turn looked at everyone present with bewilderment. The emperor looked at the duchess and said with a grin that she had now become even more beautiful. The emperor came closer to her and said that now there were other dazzling places. He said with a grin that it would be great if she decorated them. The king was shocked. Turning around, he looked at those present with intense fury. The young lady in turn was in shock as all this was driving her crazy. The king told the emperor that the traffic in the neighboring countries had recently been extremely unusual. The king said that a conflict had arisen that had damaged their border area. He looked at the emperor intently and asked him puzzled what he thought about this situation. There was a dead silence in the hall. The duchess understood why the king and queen tolerated her antics. She looked at them closely as she realized that they wanted the emperor to mediate in the conflict. The king looked closely at the emperor and said that he thought the emperor would be interested in this, since the kingdom of Esland bordered the empire. The duchess froze in place in shock at the mere mention of the kingdom. Their empire bordered several kingdoms, and the kingdom of Esland, the country that led the empire to collapse, was the homeland of the main character. The emperor looked at them intently and said that he would invite them to a banquet next spring. The king and queen were frozen in shock. They did not understand what he was talking about. The emperor looked at them with a grin and asked if they spoke openly about everything, wouldn't the conflict be resolved? The banquet next spring is an event that in the original story was called the Grand Banquet, as the main characters met at a banquet. The duchess in her turn was furious but sat very quietly. The emperor looked at her in surprise and asked if there was any problem. She smiled and said that there was no problem and that it was a very, very wonderful idea. She wanted to work until her bones turned to dust so that everyone would know about his greatness. She understood that once the emperor met the main character, the countdown to her death would begin. She knew that she needed to escape the country. The duchess looked hard at the king and queen and said with regret that she had made a terrible mistake. She decided to return the wig and fan to their rightful owners. She looked at them with a pitiful expression and said that she was very sorry for her actions. The king looked at the box of things with a keen gaze. He was furious. The king angrily said that they would take their leave, but the duchess in turn apologized to them. She said that she sincerely apologized for damaging the valuables and for having to disturb them. The duchess looked at them intently and said that she would like to make amends for the damage she had done to them. She said that if they wanted to ask her for anything, she would do it. Irina wanted them not to bring the moment of the empire's destruction closer. The king and queen looked at each other silently. The king looked at the duchess intently and said that if she wished, he would like to ask her one question. He looked closely at the young lady and said that they were thinking of expanding into a new silk business. The duchess looked at them intently with a smile on her face. She knew all about silk as it was used to make every dress the main character wore. It was expensive, and because of that, the empire was starting to run out of money. She did not understand why they needed to expand the business. The king said that he understood perfectly well that it could become a burden for the duchess. The king, looking at the duchess, said that few people knew about their silk and it had not been tested. The duchess was shocked. The king said that if they expand their business and strengthen business relations with the empire, the kingdom of Esland will not be able to treat them carelessly. He said he wanted to export silk at cost price and asked if that was too much to ask. The duchess was shocked, but knew that it was just a success for her. She walked up to the king with lightning speed and with a smile on her face said that it would not be easy, but she would try for the king. The king and queen happily thanked the duchess. She in turn knew that knowing the plot, she would be able to solve the problem. The duchess was puzzled because a little later she met the emperor. The emperor in turn looked at the documents with a grin and told the duchess that she was doing her job carefully. She was puzzled looking at the emperor. She did not understand why the one who should drink and have fun came to her office. The duchess was puzzled because he had mixed up all the documents she had been sorting all night. Irina looked at the emperor intently and said that he was overpraising her. He looked at her closely and said with a smirk that something had changed. The emperor came closer to the duchess and asked what had changed since she had decided to free the knight. He gave the duchess a long look and said that it was she who ordered the knight to be killed. The duchess froze in place in shock. The emperor said that the dog that was manipulated was supposed to approach the empress dowager. The duchess was puzzled and did not understand why the conversation turned to the dowager empress. The emperor said that he had asked for an excuse to deal with this properly, and if he lost the bet, he would let him go again. The emperor looked at her intently and asked if she shouldn't think about him running around to fulfill her request. The emperor said that it was not the same as playing with people. He looked at her with disgust. The emperor said that the more he looked at her, the more he saw how disgusting she was. He looked at her intently and said that even if it was a contract, she had to try her best. The duchess froze in place in shock. She didn't understand what was being discussed since it wasn't in the novel. She knew it was very important information, but now his disdainful gaze was devastating her mind. She looked at the emperor intently and asked for forgiveness for disturbing him. She said that right now she would get rid of what was limiting him. Standing on the windowsill, she trembled with fear. She saw the soft grass below and knew that if she pressed it down, she would not die. She knew that she should still try to take a desperate step. She wanted to sacrifice herself in order to justify the tyrant's expectations. But a moment later, the emperor grabbed her by the clothes. With lightning speed, he threw her onto the floor in the office. He looked at her with fury and said that there should be a measure in everything, including the contract. The emperor looked at the duchess with fury and contempt and said that he had not yet gotten rid of him. When the emperor left, she was left alone in the office and decided to look at the documents she had seen earlier. She realized that the duchess had made a contract with the emperor. She thought that the duchess wanted to keep the emperor in check. The young lady was puzzled because she did not know everything, and if she broke the contract, it would cause her execution. Based on these facts, she was able to learn more about the duchess. All her letters to noble families were secret agreements. The changes in the laws were beneficial only to the duchess, and the report that Eden gave her on behalf of the emperor's assistant described in detail every action of the emperor. Now she understood why the main character looked at her like that. In fact, the tyrant was not the emperor, but the duchess. As proof of the duchess's hidden power, she found suspicious things in her office. A book called Feeding Birds, hidden among work papers in a drawer of a desk with a false bottom. She found a portrait and a book about poisonous herbs. When she saw these items, she thought that they were somehow related to the contract. She looked closely at the portrait as the girl seemed very familiar to her. She felt nostalgic. She looked intently into the girl's eyes and with the speed of lightning threw the portrait away because it seemed to her that she was sharpening her teeth at her. She was puzzled and did not understand who the girl in the portrait really was. Sometime later, a maid came to her office and asking for forgiveness said that she had brought food. The maid looked intently at the duchess while smoothing out the food on the table. The duchess in turn thanked the maid for the food, but she did not understand what it was. She realized that the table was set as described in the book on Feeding the Birds. The duchess looked closely at the dishes that were on the table as they were mentioned in the book, down to the smallest detail. The duchess opened the book and began to study it intently. She knew she had to be strict about the order. She wondered if she should try. A moment later, she began feeding the pigeons. The food was arranged in order with 3 birds getting 1 appetizer, 1 main course, and dessert, while the 4th bird had to go hungry. The duchess looked at the bird and said, puzzled, that next time she would feed it too, and she asked for forgiveness. She knew for sure that all this was necessary to survive. She looked at the birds with a smile as they enjoyed their meal. But a moment later, she saw that one of the birds had become ill. The duchess was shocked and could not believe that one bird immediately became ill after eating. The duchess was in shock and did not know what to do as she saw that the bird was in great pain. She wondered why the duchess fed the birds. She wondered if it was all to detect poison. She saw blood and the sweet smell of lettuce, and she had read about such symptoms in a book about poisonous herbs. She knew that there were detailed descriptions of the plants, but there was no information about antidotes. She didn't know what to do. She knew that it was necessary to take the poisonous herb in small doses to stop me from acting. She was puzzled that the Duchess used a cruel method. She was in shock and did not understand why she could not help the bird. She looked closely at the bird and said that she would bury it in a sunny place. The Duchess realized that she could not save the dead bird. She was puzzled because she knew he couldn't just let them die, but she knew she had no choice and had to use this method. She didn't understand who wanted to poison her. She slowly took the salad. She thought that the emperor or empress might have poisoned her. She wanted to start with the easiest opponent. A moment later, she came to the knight and asked if everything was going well in his new position. She knew he had almost died at the hands of the Duchess and could have slipped poison. She saw that he looked as if he did not know why she was there. Adam said he was getting used to it little by little. She smiled and said it was better than the guillotine. He looked at her with a smile and thanked her for saving him. She wondered if he knew nothing. She knew he was trying to side with the empress. She said with a smile that she had brought him something since his wounds were not yet healed and he could not take care of himself. A moment later, she handed him a plate of salad. The knight looked at the Duchess in surprise. She looked at him intently with a smile as she waited for him to give her an answer. She hoped that he felt guilty. Eden said that when the Empress Dowager's maid found out he was working for her, he felt like she was going to leave him. He said that she saved him from the emperor and was now taking care of his health. He said that he was very grateful to her and would not make such a mistake again. She didn't understand why the Duchess tried to kill her man. He looked at her and said with a smile that he would immediately try the salad she had prepared for him. The Duchess froze in place in surprise. Eden N. probably looked at her and with a radiant smile thanked her for the food. The Duchess was shocked. She didn't understand how he could eat it. But a moment later, he began to cough violently and the Duchess was in shock. The Duchess was shocked when she looked at the knight. She asked if he was okay, as she had just picked him in the garden. Eden apologized to the Duchess, as he was simply too happy to have swallowed the salad too quickly. He gave her a beaming smile and said that he was fine now. She in turn understood that if he had tried to poison her, he would not have eaten the food she brought him. She was furious because she knew she had prepared and given him the dish. But it wasn't him. Irina wondered who it was. She thought that it was most likely the emperor, and the thought alone made her feel uneasy. The Duchess slowly returned to the office, absorbed in her thoughts. She knew she shouldn't jump to conclusions. She knew that the Duchess did not get along with the emperor because he had many political opponents behind him. A moment later, she dropped her jacket as she felt sick. She thought she would be okay, so she ate a little more salad. She was puzzled because she now realized that she shouldn't have done that. She knew that she simply couldn't pass out in a place like that. She knew she couldn't pass out in a place where people were hiding who wanted to kill her. Looking out the window, she saw a scary raven watching her. Looking at the Duchess, the emperor sighed heavily and said that he had no choice. A moment later, he caught her. The Duchess stood frozen in bewilderment as she did not expect to see the emperor in front of her. She looked at him intently, wondering why he was next to her. She knew that if he wanted to kill her now was the perfect moment since there was no one around. She glanced sideways at the raven, as she was puzzled, for she knew that it was certainly an omen of death. A moment later, the emperor took the young lady in his arms. The Duchess was shocked as she did not expect such a thing. She said that he should put her on the ground since she could move on her own. He looked at her with fury and asked if she could stop twitching. She looked intently at the emperor, for she knew that if she began to move, she would immediately die by his hand. A moment later, she sighed heavily, looking at the emperor. She was confused, as she did not understand what he was thinking. The raven slowly flew up to the emperor and landed right on his hand. The emperor looked at the raven and asked if it was watching the Duchess well, and it in turn croaked obediently. As the raven flew away, he gave the emperor a note which the emperor slowly caught. The young lady looked intently at the Duchess and said with a smile that she was very glad to see her. The Duchess looked at the lady. She saw that all the fingers on her hand, except the thumb, were pointing upwards, and it was the Icelandic handshake. She remembered that this was mentioned several times in the novel, and that was how the emperor had embraced the main character. She was puzzled because she never thought she would see this in real life. The lady told the Duchess that she knew the Duchess would come, so she made sweet tea. The Duchess smiled and said that the tea smelled wonderful. The Duchess said with a smile that she was very sorry she had not come earlier. The lady looked at the duchess with joy and asked if she was serious. The lady told the duchess that she knew she was very busy, and she felt she wouldn't be able to come, and she was very upset. The duchess knew that the dowager empress sent her an invitation every week. She knew that the empress wanted to get closer to the duchess. She looked at the empress intently as she was puzzled. She wanted to check everything. The duchess said with a smile that she didn't want to come empty-handed, so she brought her a gift. The duchess looked at the empress with a smile and said that she had prepared tea from the Marisa flowers. The empress said with a smile that she was very surprised and also asked if more fragrant flowers were not used for tea. The duchess said that the fragrant flowers were very nice, but she really liked this delicate scent. Looking at the empress, she said with a smile that these flowers did not contain poison, so she did not need to worry. The duchess looked at the maid and said that it was she who helped her in preparing the tea. The maid in turn was shaking very much with fear. Irina told the empress that the girl was doing an excellent job. The main suspect in poisoning her food was the maid, and if she began to interrogate her now, she would only reveal that she was looking for the criminals. The duchess looked at the maid and told her to pour tea for the empress. The maid obediently agreed. But a moment later, the maid stumbled and accidentally spilled the tea. With the speed of lightning, the maid fell to her knees and, looking at the duchess, begged for forgiveness. The empress looked at the duchess with puzzlement and asked if she was okay and apologized. The duchess smiled and said that part of the tea was cold and nothing had happened to her. She said she would like to stay longer, but now she must change her dress. Everyone looked closely at the duchess. Now she had no doubt that the dowager empress had done it. She realized that soon the empress would pay her servants to poison her food. She was puzzled and did not understand why she had to do this. The young lady turned around when the empress called her. The empress said that if she ever got into trouble, she could always come to her, and also said that it was better not to trust her with the temperature. Irina was puzzled, as she could not understand at all what the empress was thinking. She wanted to know why the duchess was against the empress. But unfortunately, there was no record of this. She would have preferred to poison herself before she was executed. She knew that from now on she had to look after the empress. The duchess was puzzled. She looked into the distance and was dumbfounded. She didn't understand what was going on at all, since she saw the emperor with his maid. She knew that this maid of the empress was standing with the emperor. She did not understand what they were doing at such a time. The young lady was puzzled and did not understand at all what was going on. She remembered that the woman in the portrait and the main character had light brown hair. She was puzzled because she understood that his preference was simply obvious. She remembered that the empress had told her not to trust the emperor. Looking at the emperor, she wondered if he was really behind all of this. She was in shock and knew that she had to escape from the palace immediately. The duchess looked at the emperor and said that she would like to go on a trip to inspect his domain. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was taking on such a difficult job. He wanted her to explain. She said she wanted to know if the treasury was getting empty every day because there was a leak. He looked at her with a smirk and asked why she didn't honestly say that she was going for the money. He said that it was obvious to everyone about her obsession with it. She was shocked, wondering if the treasury really belonged to her. She said she didn't think she could compete with the emperor's wisdom. She wanted to escape right now, even though it was just a trip. She knew that she knew nothing about the country, so she could not avoid death. She said she hoped he would enjoy a more luxurious life than other monarchs. She said that during the trip she would let everyone know of his intentions. She said she wanted to present the emperor as a saint who would forever remain in the history of the empire. He was furious. The emperor looked at her intently and asked if she really wanted to introduce him as a saint. She was shocked because she didn't understand what was going on, and the sudden change in atmosphere made her feel uneasy. He looked at her with a furious grin and said that it was a great idea. She knew she had made a mistake and he thought she was making fun of him. She knew she needed to clear up the misunderstanding quickly. She said that he was a great saint and she wanted his name to be widely known. The emperor said angrily that the blueberry harvest was bad and there were none for his woman. He said that the baron's head must be cut off immediately. She was shocked because she knew that blueberries were grown in the area where the baron was executed. She glanced sideways at the young man who was following her. He smiled and asked if she wanted some berries. He seemed like a simpleton to her who was only interested in berries. She looked at him and said that if he was going to the southern continent to pick blueberry seedlings, he would need to have a good rest there. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was saying that. She understood that if he returned, he would be immediately executed. The Baron said that he wanted to go on a trip next year and asked if she would like to go with him. The Duchess said with a smile that she would let him know later. The raven flew to the Emperor with a report and slowly flew into the office. The Emperor looked at the raven in surprise and said that he returned very quickly. He looked at the raven and asked if the Baron was with the Duchess. The raven croaked in response. The Emperor looked at the raven and said that he had sent him to scout out the situation, and he had overheard their conversation. The Emperor was surprised by the sudden journey and wondered if she was thinking of running away because of love. The Emperor was furious because he knew that there was a limit to everything. He knew that there was a contract between them that had to be honored. The Baron greeted the Duchess with a smile and asked if she had had a good rest. She smiled and said that she felt very comfortable and thanked him for his concern, but in turn, she understood perfectly well that this was another lie. She could not sleep at night as she was looking through the accounting books. She was shocked because she saw an accounting book with no traces of tax evasion. She knew he had definitely not slept well, but he looked fine. She looked at the night closely and wondered how it was possible to keep it a secret that she had ordered him to steal the ledger. The Duchess in turn knew that even for the Baron, this would be a difficult task. Eden P. felt that someone was looking at him and turning around gave the Duchess a radiant smile. She was in shock and did not understand why her heart was beating so hard. She did not understand what she was doing because she knew that her life was on the line. She looked at the river in surprise and said that she smelled a strange smell. The Baron timidly asked for forgiveness and said that the quality of their water had become poor. The Duchess did not understand how the river had come to be in this state. The Baron said that the sewage continued to flow from the Marquis's estate. He said it wasn't a big deal, but the berry bushes near the river had dried up, and the Duchess froze in shock. She looked at him intently and said that this was not right, and also asked if these were not the Baron's most precious bushes. She said with a smile that he didn't need to worry since she was the Grand Duchess. Irina said that she would definitely return his precious bushes. Baron was shocked with joy. At the same time, the Emperor and his thief were watching them. The raven looking at the Emperor croaked with joy. The Emperor said that the raven had made a mistake since this was not love or affection at all. The Emperor said that if the Duchess were in love, her expression would not be like that. A moment later, the Emperor remembered her words to him. She said that she would make him a saint. The Emperor introduced the young lady, for he knew that the look of a man in love could not be like that. The Duchess thanked the Marquis with a smile for the sumptuous dinner. The Marquis in turn looked at the Duchess with a smile and asked if she would like to drink more of the fine wine. The Duchess looked closely at the table. She noticed that there were many different dishes, but meat was repeated. She felt an unpleasant aroma of wine. Irina looked at the Marquis and noticed that he was wearing only expensive clothes. Looking at the Marquis, she realized that the accounting book was in complete disarray. Irina was going to throw out a decoy to expose him. The Duchess looked closely at the Marquis and asked with a smile on her face if everything was well on his farm now. The Marquis sighed heavily. Looking at the Duchess, he told her not to remind him of this. Since due to crop failure, it was difficult to collect taxes from the locals. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really was having a crop failure now. The Duchess looked at the Marquis intently and said that it was very strange since it seemed that the Baron had a very good harvest. The Marquis looked at the Duchess in surprise and confusion and asked if such a tiny area could really have a good harvest. She said with a grin that this was true and that berry bushes grew well near the river. The Marquis was very angry. The Duchess looked closely at the Marquis and asked if he was really going to monopolize the berry business. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The Duchess, in turn, said that this low-growing plant requires a large supply of water. She asked where the Baron had managed to get so much, and the Marquess, in turn, said angrily that it was simply impossible and asked if the Baron had already used water from his river. The Marquis was furious. He shouted various curses at the Baron, while the Duchess, in turn, was puzzled since she understood that the Marquis considered the river to be his. She looked at the Marquis intently and said that since the berry business had become successful and beyond the waters of the river, the profits should be his. She looked at him intently and said that he must definitely claim his rights. The Marquis said that he would certainly do everything right away. The Duchess looked at him with a grin and said that she had a great idea. She said that he should build a dam. The duchess said that in that case the baron would not be able to grow berries, and he would succeed in the berry business with the help of the dam. The marquis was shocked. He shouted that without any doubt the wisdom of the duchess knows no bounds. She looked at the marquis intently and told him to think again very carefully, as the cost of building the dam was very high. Looking at the marquis, the duchess asked him how many years of hunger his people could endure. She saw that he was very angry and that he was cornered. She said with a smile that the prosperity of his lands, like the glory of the empire, the imperial family could finance the construction at low interest rates. If he showed some documents, the marquis was very pleased with her statements and asked what documents she needed. She said with a smile that she needed to see his tax return, a list of assets he owned, a statement of sources of funds, and statements of various transactions. The duchess looked at the man closely and asked if he had brought all the documents. The marquis sighed heavily and said that he had brought all the documents since at the moment the state of his assets was not very good. She looked at him intently and asked why he stole money from the empire then. The marquis was puzzled and said in a trembling voice that he did not understand what she was talking about. A moment later, the knight presented the documents to the duchess. The marquis was stunned as he saw the account book which he hid in his secret safe. He did not understand why it was now in the hands of the duchess. The duchess looked closely at the ledger. She said that he had invested large sums abroad and carried out illegal transactions under false names and even sent the profits to Esland. The duchess looked at the marquess intently and asked what would happen if His Majesty found out about this. He froze in place from shock, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, the marquis fell on his knees before the duchess and begged for forgiveness. He asked her for help and said that he would certainly do everything. The duchess looked at him intently and, with a predatory look, said that she wanted to give him one piece of advice. She said with a grin that only smart people could afford to cheat. She said that she would certainly lend him money for the construction, but he had to pay the taxes that had accumulated over time. She looked at him intently and said that he could only pay half. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She looked at him with a smirk and said that in return he would give her all the money he sent to Esland. The duchess looked at the marquis intently and with a grin said that in that case she would act as if she knew nothing and nothing had happened. She wanted to replenish the treasury and finance her exile. She really wanted everything to work out very well. A moment later, she was taken aback as the carriage jerked very violently. The duchess was very much puzzled and did not understand what was happening. As she got out of the carriage, she looked at the knight and asked what had happened. The knight looked at her intently and timidly said that the road was uneven and it would be very difficult to ride in the carriage. Eden approached them. He said that he had brought a horse so that she could ride it. He looked at the duchess with a smile and said that the horse was very calm and the duchess's journey would go smoothly. The young lady in her turn was very much puzzled and wondered whether she was really supposed to ride a horse. She was more alert than she had ever been on a horse. She wondered about the threats. Wouldn't it be more logical to take the easy way out in a situation like this? She looked closely at the knight as she wanted him to say something. The knight smiled a radiant smile and said that the duchess had always enjoyed riding horses and that this was a great idea since they had not seen her on a horse for a long time. The young lady in turn was very puzzled. She walked up to the horse and slowly tried to climb onto it. She was puzzled by the fact that the saddle was positioned very high. She hoped that everything would be fine. A moment later, she mounted the horse. With ease, the young lady looked at the horse in surprise, as she did not expect this. She was surprised since she had coped with such a task very easily, but she wondered if the duchess's body really remembered everything. She thought that maybe things weren't so bad after all, but a moment later, the horse for some reason went berserk. The duchess was in shock and didn't know what to do. The horse rushed forward with lightning speed, and the knights looked after it in surprise and shouted. The young lady was puzzled because she saw that the horse was behaving very strangely. Unfortunately, she couldn't control it. Irina Z wondered if she had been given something. She was very confused in this situation because she didn't know what to do. The duchess in turn was puzzled, wondering whether she was really going to die like this. But a moment later, a knight rushed to the aid of the duchess. He skillfully and with lightning speed grabbed the horse by the reins. The duchess looked at the man in surprise. She didn't know who it was. The man looked at her closely and asked with a smile if she was okay. He said that she should not be released into the water even if she was very scared. He looked at her intently and said that it was very dangerous for her to remain on the horse and that she needed to get off. The duchess in turn thanked the man for saving her. The name of the raven was watching them from above. The duchess sighed heavily and said that she survived thanks to him and she needed to repay him. Irina asked if he could tell her his name. The man told her that she didn't need to worry about it at all. He said that he was just there and saw that she had a problem. A moment later, he walked up to the horse and looked closely at the saddle. He said that she should take a look. The duchess froze in shock. The man looked at her closely and said that there was a piece of glass under the saddle. He said that this must have been what angered the horse and caused the animal to behave like that. The duchess in turn understood that this was not an accident at all. She understood that someone was definitely trying to kill her. The knights rushed to the duchess in a hurry. Eden looked at the duchess with confusion and asked if she was okay. The duchess in turn looked at the knights holding a glass in her hand. A moment later, she put her hand behind her back. Looking at the knights, she said that the man had helped her. Eden looked at the duchess and bowed, saying that he would accept any punishment. She in turn looked at him and said that the horse had not run away because of him, while at the same time she held the glass in her hand and trembled. Eden saw that the duchess was trembling. He understood that it was very hard for her since she almost died. He took off his jacket and slowly walked up to her. A moment later, he threw it over her shoulders. The duchess looked at the knight in surprise. Eden looked at the duchess with a puzzled expression and said that he thought she was not well, and asked if they would continue on. The duchess in turn said nothing, simply looked into the distance, but a moment later she said that that was enough for today as she was going to rest. She sat in the tent and slowly looked at the piece of glass that was the cause of the unpleasant situation. The duchess looked closely at the piece of glass. She realized that it could easily be attached to the saddle. She was puzzled because she knew that everything had been done with the utmost care, but she was worried because she did not understand who was trying to kill her. She did everything possible to avoid meeting the assassins from the palace. The duchess glanced sideways at the birds who were alarmed. She came closer to them because she did not understand what was wrong with them. A moment later she turned around as she felt someone's presence. She froze in place as she saw that the knight was about to swing his sword at her. But a moment later she still managed to jump back. She was confused because she did not understand who attacked her. She ran to the exit and screamed. She called for help, but everything was fair. A moment later the man grabbed her by her clothes and threw her to the ground. The duchess was trembling with fear. It was hard for her to breathe. Now she realized that the true owner of the body was right, because instead of saving others out of pity, she should have trusted her. Since she knew that the true owner had survived many attacks, she knew that she still had to kill Eden. The young lady was furious because she knew that she was just being stupid. She knew that if she had acted like a real duchess, then perhaps she too would have been able to escape. A moment later, the man attacked the knight who was holding the duchess. The man stood up to defend the duchess and Eden became wary. He was ready for battle. A moment later he changed his mind and rushed towards the exit. The man in turn cursed loudly because he understood that he had missed it. The duchess approached the man and said that the knight would not be able to descend the mountain on his own, and most likely he would go to the carriage. She looked at him intently and told him not to kill the knight as she needed to know something. They still managed to catch the knight who attacked the duchess. The man looked at the knight with contempt and said that he knew about all the movements of the guards. Looking at the duchess, he said that she had better be careful, as this is a very dangerous man. The duchess in turn was puzzled because despite the noise she had made, no one came. Looking at the knight, she wanted to cut off his head immediately, but something stopped her. She came closer to him and lowering herself looked at him. The duchess asked if he could explain what had happened. She looked at him intently and said that she knew he was not the type to do something like that. She asked furiously who ordered him to kill her. The duchess looked at the knight and said that if he did not tell everything, then she simply would have no other choice. She said that she would send him to court. Eden in turn said nothing and did not even look at the duchess. The man looked sideways at the duchess and said that it would be better to kill him right now. She in turn understood that this was true, because she knew that it did not matter what excuse he came up with. She did not want to kill people of her own free will because she was not a true duchess. She looked at the man intently and bowed, thanking him for saving her, calling him emperor. He looked at her with a smile and said that it seemed he could not hide his identity even from the eyes of the duchess. She bowed and said that he had saved her twice and she would never forget it. The emperor looked at the duchess in surprise and said that she was behaving very strangely now. He said that she should not thank him, because if it were not for the contract, he would not have saved her. The duchess looked at him intently and, puzzled, said that his fidelity to the contract was an example for everyone. A moment later, the emperor turned around. As he was about to leave, he said that he had done enough for her and it was time for him to go. The duchess was in shock. She wondered if he would leave as if nothing had happened. Irina O called to the emperor and told him to stop. She looked at him intently and said that it was already dark and asked why he did not stay in the camp for the night. Carden told her to get out of the way. The duchess was puzzled and said that she practically died today and that it could happen a third time. She said that if she died, their contract would be terminated. He looked at the duchess in surprise as he was surprised by her behavior. But a moment later he said that she was right. After all, he asked if she was asking him to stay with her. They walked slowly into the tent. The duchess smiled and said that if she had known that he would come here, she would have prepared the tent better. The duchess looked at the emperor with a puzzled expression and said that it seemed that this would not be enough for him. The emperor sighed heavily and said that it seemed that she was reading his mind. The duchess froze in place, looking at the emperor, as she saw that he had already begun to undress. She looked at him puzzled and asked what he was doing. For a second, memories of the emperor's women flashed before her eyes. A moment later, she sat down on the floor and said she would stay there. She told herself she needed to be in control. She knew there was nothing worse than being promiscuous. The young lady was shocked because in order to escape from the womanizer, she was going to turn into an ice cube. She was shocked because it was very cold. The young lady wondered if this was normal, but still she knew that something was wrong. Looking at the emperor, she was furious because she saw that he was completely fine. She looked at the blanket and wondered if she should cover herself with that too. A moment later, the emperor rose from his bed. She looked at the emperor in confusion and asked for forgiveness for being too loud. He looked at her and told her to just lie down. Irina looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. With lightning speed, the emperor grabbed the young lady by the hand. A moment later, she was already on the bed. Carden looked at the duchess with fury and said that he did not want to listen to her whining, so she should sleep on the bed. The duchess lay down with lightning speed and under the covers and said with a smile that he must sleep on the bed. She did not understand how his body could be subjected to such a test. He looked at her intently and said that judging by her words, she was very pleased with her loss. The duchess decided to object. He looked at her intently and said with a grin that if she was so worried they could lie down together. She froze in shock as she didn't expect to hear something like that. The emperor came closer to her and said that the bed was quite spacious, and if she was so worried about him, then they could lie down together. He said with a grin that he thought she would be very upset if they did not lie down together. She froze in surprise and asked puzzled what he had just said. The emperor looked at her intently as if nothing had happened and said that he would not persuade her if she wanted to sleep on the floor. For a few minutes she thought about everything but still knew that she would not be able to sleep on the cold floor, and asking for forgiveness lay down in the same bed with the emperor. She was confused because she realized that she had made a mistake. She couldn't even sleep in such a situation. Early in the morning the emperor woke up first. His surprise knew no bounds. He froze in surprise as he saw that he was hugging the duchess. Irina, in turn, muttered in her sleep. She said that she really liked the warmth, looking at the duchess. The emperor became furious. He did not understand what she was trying to achieve. He saw that she suddenly took up helping some small harrow. He wondered if she had not had disagreements with the marquis. The emperor was a little surprised as he knew that she had never made the first move towards him. He looked at the sleeping duchess with fury and asked what she was planning. The empress read the letter in which the marquis wrote that he would have to hand over his savings to the duchess. The dowager empress was furious, as she knew that the duchess loved money very much. The maid looked at the empress dowager and asked if she should tell him not to pass on anything. The empress in turn wondered if there was another way. Looking sideways at the maid, she said that the marquis could take care of it himself. The maid said that the duchess was heading to the lands of Margrave Hesban. The dowager empress looked at the maid and said that there were their supporters there, but she still had to tell the margrave to be ready to receive the duchess. The empress sighed heavily and said that she was very sorry, as she had hoped that they could become friends. She also asked if the emperor had returned. The maid said that he had already returned, and this time he had visited remote areas. The maid, looking at the empress, said that His Majesty said that he knew the whole capital very well, and he wanted to find a woman in a new place. The empress said that he was a fool and did not understand how he could sit on the throne. The empress sighed heavily and said that if her son had been alive, this would not have happened. The duchess woke up and did not see the emperor next to her. She sighed heavily because she knew that she would not be able to sleep well if he were next to her. She looked at her birds and said with a smile that it was time for breakfast. With tears in her eyes, she looked at them and said that now, unfortunately, they cannot eat tasty food. A moment later, the emperor came into the tent and, looking at the duchess, said that she had managed to move the birds to such a cold place. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected him to come to her. She smiled and said that she had already brought a stove for the birds since they had spent a lot of time together, and she had become very attached to them. The emperor looked at the duchess with anger and said that he was hearing about the stove from her lips again. She looked at him and said with a smile that she was very sorry, and if he would tell her what was wrong with the stove, she could improve it. He looked at her hard and told her to stop talking, and he would stay here until the morning, so it was time for him to go. Finally, he told her that she could now take care of herself. The duchess in turn looked at the emperor in surprise. She did not understand where he was rushing to. She knew that he would return when the time came. In the evening, the emperor was having fun in the tavern. He was drinking and having fun. The man looked at him intently and said with a smile that, despite all his beauty, he knew how to drink well. The emperor smiled and said that it was very simple. A moment later, a woman who was already a little drunk approached him. She said that she had never seen him there before. She asked what brought him to them. He looked at her intently and said with a grin that he was looking for a beautiful woman, and he had already looked from all the capital girls. She smiled and said that it was very funny. She came closer to him and asked if he wanted to spend the night with her. The emperor froze in place, but a moment later he glanced sideways at one table and saw a man there who was watching him. A moment later he looked closely at the girl and said with a smile that he would be happy to spend the night with her. Sometime later, the emperor and his companion entered the room. He threw her into the bed with lightning speed, and she fell asleep. The emperor in turn sighed heavily because he knew that he simply had no choice since he was being followed. The emperor looked at the girl and sighed heavily. He was glad that she was sleeping. He knew that once a man saw him with a woman, he would quietly return to the dowager empress. Cardan was furious, wondering how much longer he would have to do this. The knights bowed to the duchess and said that they were very sorry, as they had missed the knight Eden. The duchess in turn looked closely at the knights. She saw blood and broken chains. The knight looked at the duchess intently and said that since Eden, a man of great talent, the knights who were guarding him were unable to deal with him. He asked the duchess if they should form a search party. She looked closely at the knights who were wounded. She understood that he was as strong as the emperor. She understood that it was already a miracle that they managed to capture him with so many people. She froze in place as everything in her gut told her that he needed to be killed. The duchess looked closely at the knights and said that they should first postpone the pursuit as they needed to see to the wounded. She said that as soon as first aid was given, they should go to the nearest town. The knight bowed before the duchess and asked for forgiveness. He said that this was the only place in this small town where he could stay. She sighed heavily and said that this was a very strange place, but still she only needed a bedroom and a bathroom. She looked at them intently and said that they should place the wounded first. A moment later, the knights knelt before her. The duchess was shocked as she did not understand what they were doing at all. She knew that their condition could get worse if they were kneeling. The knight looked at the duchess and said that they had let the knight go and must be punished. He said that she must punish them so that such a thing would not happen in the future. The duchess was shocked. She stared at them and wondered if there really needed to be a reason to treat a person. She knew that if she didn't say anything now, her dignity as a duchess would fall in their eyes. She looked at all the knights and said that they would receive their punishment in the imperial palace. The duchess looked at the knights intently and said that they should not repeat such mistakes again. She looked at them with a smile and asked if they themselves didn't know about it. She said that she was very interested in whether their devotion would make her feel any better. She asked if she could forget about what happened today. The duchess looked at them and said that they needed to stop thinking about such nonsense and needed to concentrate on the treatment. First, the knights were surprised. They said that they would definitely risk their lives to protect her. The man was trembling with fear. He looked at the duchess and said that her room was on the second floor at the end of the corridor. She looked at him in surprise and thanked him. The duchess was furious. She wanted to go in and wash herself immediately and then go to bed. Irina knew that there was an inn on the first floor, so it was very noisy here, but compared to spending the night in a tent, this was heaven for her. A moment later, the emperor jumped out into the corridor and shouted angrily to the owner that the water was simply icy. He was furious because he had not washed in warm water for a long time. The innkeeper and the duchess stood frozen in shock, looking at the half-naked emperor. The duchess looked at the emperor in surprise, and he in turn froze in shock. The duchess turned away in embarrassment, and the innkeeper in turn said that he would certainly sort out the situation. The duchess, puzzled, told the emperor that she did not expect to see him in such a situation. The emperor was shocked as he realized that she saw a girl sleeping in a bed. The emperor looked at the duchess and said that it was just a misunderstanding since he had nothing to do with the woman and she was just sleeping in his bed. The duchess, puzzled, said that he must be very tired. He said angrily that nothing had happened and she was just sleeping. The duchess said that she understood everything. He came closer to her and said that everything was wrong. She was taken aback, looking at the emperor. He looked at her intently and said with fury that she must not misunderstand. The emperor shouted that he was just trying to match her great game. Irina froze in bewilderment, looking at the emperor. She looked at the emperor in surprise as she wondered what game he was talking about. She wondered if he was talking about the contract extension he had mentioned earlier. She knew that if the conversation continued in this direction, he would suspect that she knew nothing about the agreement. The duchess said that it was late and that she had to go to bed. She said that she was very worried that if things continued like this, the body would be damaged. He looked at her with fury and asked if she didn't believe him. He looked at her intently and asked why they all thought he had abandoned Eleanor. The duchess looked intently at the emperor. She wondered if he was talking about the woman in the portrait now. She knew he was a tyrant who changed women more often than gloves. She wondered if it was because of one person that he couldn't get rid of the duchess. A moment later, the emperor pulled away from the duchess and, sighing heavily, said that it would be foolish of him to try to justify himself now. He decided to enter the room, but the duchess was surprised, looked at him, and said that this was his room. The emperor looked at the duchess with a grin and said that he would like to ask for forgiveness, but his bed was already occupied. Carden said that if she wanted, he could give her one side of the bed like last time. She was shocked by such a statement. She looked at the door, puzzled, and wondered how big the bed was. She knew everything was fine yesterday, but she wondered if it would be the same today. Sometime later, the duchess was sleeping peacefully in bed, and the emperor was waiting for his friend. A moment later, a raven flew to the emperor and brought him a letter. From the note, the emperor learned about the escape, the treatment of the wounded, and the deviation from the course. The emperor looked at the raven in surprise and asked if he had really let it escape. He looked at the sleeping duchess in surprise as he did not understand why she had decided to help the wounded. The duchess slept peacefully and asked in her sleep where her stove was. She told no one to go near the stove. The raven could barely contain his laughter, and the emperor was furious. He didn't like all this. Sometime later, they arrived at the place, and Margrave Hesbon greeted them. The Margrave looked at the duchess with a smile and said that he was very glad to meet her. He smiled and said that the road must have been difficult, and invited them to go inside. The duchess, together with the emperor, slowly followed the man. The emperor looked sideways at everyone present and said that everyone had their hands in place. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The emperor looked closely at the duchess and said that the knights were fine who had lost the murderer she had caught. He said that it was very surprising that they still had limbs left. She sighed heavily and said that they were useful, so she forgave them for their mistake. He looked at her in surprise and said with a grin that he had no idea that the duchess was such a merciful person. The duchess began to speak, but the margrave interrupted her. He looked at the emperor and addressed him. He asked what he was doing and told him not to delay, as he needed to take the duchess's horse and go to the stables. The duchess, in turn, was shocked by what the margrave was saying. She saw the angry expression on his face and felt uneasy. The emperor looked closely at the man and asked with a grin what he was talking about. The duchess in turn understood that at this rate the margrave would be executed. She wondered who would then defend the border. The duchess looked at the margrave and said that she would personally supervise everything. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was thinking. He said that she should leave the dirty work to her subordinates. The duchess in turn knew that she was a subordinate, looked at the margrave with a smile and said that caring for her beloved horses gave her peace of mind. He looked at her intently and said that if she said so, then he would accept it. A moment later, the duchess looked at the emperor and told him to follow her. The margrave looked at the young men and said that even inside it was very cold, and that this building was built as a fortress, and it was even colder there than in other castles. The duchess in turn followed the margrave slowly, but she was trembling very much. He sighed heavily and said that he could lend her his cloak if she was cold. She said, puzzled, that it seemed not so cold here. He looked at her and said in surprise that he was glad she was okay. She was shocked and wondered why he kept provoking the tyrant. She wondered if he knew how many times he had already walked on thin ice. She knew she had to change the subject quickly. She looked at the man closely and said that the castle was still large, but there were few people in it. He looked at her and said that he really loved silence and had specially reduced the number of people. She looked at the man in surprise and intently, as she did not understand what kind of expression he had on his face. He knew that this was what people looked like who hated talking on the phone. She wondered if she should use her professional skills again. Irina looked at him intently and said with a smile that she was going to sort out the problems throughout the empire, and if there was anything that was bothering him, he could tell her. The margrave looked at her closely and said that she did not need to worry about such things, since their family had been fulfilling their duties for many generations. The duchess said with a smile that everywhere they had been, there had been problems. Irina said that farming in the baron's territory was difficult due to the pollution of the river. Money problems were found in the marquess's estate. She said that it was very difficult to manage the territory. The margrave looked at her intently and said that there was one problem that was bothering him. He looked at the duchess with puzzlement and said that a year ago, residents of these lands began to disappear. She looked at the margrave with surprise and excitement and asked if he really meant to say that they were moving somewhere. He looked at her intently and said that this was not so, since they disappeared in an instant as if someone had kidnapped them. Last month, the number of missing people reached 100 people. The duchess was stunned by this statement. She was shocked and simply could not believe it. Irina in turn wondered if this was the beginning of the story. She knew that according to the original, this world was not alien to the intrigues with the kidnapping of people by slave traders. With the tyrant's connivance, the slave trade grew like a weed in the garden. In the end, the rebellion was easy to predict, and the empire fell after the war with Estland. She could not even imagine that history would begin so quickly. The duchess said that she would investigate this problem. He looked at the duchess in surprise and asked if this was true, and if she would personally take care of this issue. Irina said with a smile that this was true since guarding the border was their common duty. She, in turn, understood perfectly well that the closer the fall of the empire, the closer its end, and in order to gain a little time, it was necessary to slow down the plot line. She knew that she would certainly deal with the slave trade once and for all. The margrave looked at the maid and told her to immediately bring the best alcohol for the duchess. The duchess, in turn, said that alcohol was not acceptable now. He looked at her with a smile, said that she didn't need to refuse. He asked when else she would get such a chance. She smiled puzzledly and said that she didn't want to drink. He looked at her intently and said that he was already an old man and was not able to understand her feelings. He looked at the emperor and told him to come over to them and pour them a drink. The margrave came closer to the duchess and said with a smile that he was no longer at an age to drink with her. She was shocked and wondered if she could run away right now. The emperor looked at the duchess with a grin and asked if she would like to drink with him. She shouted that this was just nonsense. The margrave looked at the young men with bewilderment. He looked at the young man and asked why he didn't take off his cloak since he was indoors. The duchess looked at the emperor with bewilderment and said that he shouldn't do that because the cloak suited him very well. The margrave, in turn, said that the people were unhappy. The duchess was shocked because she knew that it was simply unbearable. She shouted very loudly that she had a jawline fetish. Everyone looked at the duchess in bewilderment, as they did not understand what she was talking about. The duchess, in turn, wanted to simply die on that very spot. The margrave looked intently at the emperor and said that they had never really introduced themselves. The emperor looked intently at the duchess, holding the bottle in his hands. The emperor said that his name was Nanroania. The duchess was shocked and froze in place. She remembered how she slept in the same bed with the emperor and was very embarrassed. The margrave looked closely at the young man and said that he had a very unusual name. Translated from in Korean, his name meant that he was not a stove. He looked hard at the duchess and said with a smile that since it was unusual, he hoped she would not forget it. The duchess looked at the emperor with embarrassment. A moment later, she picked up the wineglass and turned it over with lightning speed. She was shocked and wondered if he thought that because of his pretty face, she was going to the scaffold. She stared at the empty glass. Since the wine she had tasted seemed so familiar to her, she wondered where she could have tasted it. But a moment later, she saw blood on her hands. She was in shock, like everyone else in the room. The emperor rushed to the duchess with lightning speed. He was in shock as he did not expect to see something like this. He shouted and called her, but all was in vain. The margrave was in shock. He in turn shouted that the wine was poisoned. Looking at the emperor, he asked if the duchess had really died. The emperor looked at the man with fury and told him to shut his mouth immediately. He told him to call a doctor and bring an antipyretic, and he also had to interrogate everyone who was in the castle. The emperor looked at the margrave with a sharp and angry look and told him to do it now if he did not want to be accused of murder. At that very moment, the margrave shouted that the gates should be locked immediately and that all who touched the wine should be immediately detained. The emperor was furious. He said that this was simply a breach of contract. He looked at the duchess and said angrily that there was something else he needed her for. He angrily kicked down the door and entered the room. He slowly laid the duchess on the bed and, looking at her intently, said that his blood could to some extent neutralize the poison. A moment later, the emperor kissed the duchess. The emperor was furious. He hugged the duchess tighter and said that if she even tried to die, she would rot in the ground without a funeral service or ceremony. He said that she could not die without his permission. Sometime later, the doctor began to examine the duchess. He sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, there was no hope. The doctor said that her dose was much higher than the lethal dose, and now there was no hope. He told the gentleman that he advised him to be prepared for the worst. The emperor looked at the doctor with anger and told him to go away. The doctor was shocked as he did not expect this. The emperor slowly approached the duchess and said with a grin that he knew better than anyone how hard it was for her. He angrily told her to stop these games and open her eyes quickly. He saw that her clothes were all covered in blood and hurried to the warehouse to get her some decent clothes. Passing by all the things, he saw a chest. The emperor decided to examine it. Opening the chest, he froze in place from shock. He did not understand why this thing was here. Sometime later, the duchess woke up. She was puzzled as she felt very ill. The emperor came closer to the duchess and asked angrily if she had woken up. The duchess was perplexed, as the emperor's face frightened her very much. He looked at her with fury and asked where she got it from. The duchess froze in shock. She did not understand why this portrait was in the hands of the emperor. She understood that it must be all connected with the contract. She secretly brought the portrait here. The emperor looked at her with fury and asked again where she got the portrait from. The duchess was in shock. She understood that if she said anything unnecessary now, she would be in danger of death. She looked intently at the emperor and said that this was a memory of Eleanor. He came closer to her and asked angrily if this was in memory of Eleanor. He looked at her with fury and shouted at her to immediately tell him what kind of person Eleanor was. Irina froze in shock as she looked at the emperor. She knew that Eleanor was the maid of the Empress Dowager and the main character of the original story. Eleanor had the same hair color as the woman in the portrait. She knew that even a contract would not help to break the connection with her. Irina looked at the emperor intently and said that Eleanor, the emperor's beloved. The emperor gave the young lady the portrait and said that everything was correct, and also wondered why he was asking her about it at all. He looked at her sideways and told her to rest. He mentally replayed their conversation because he thought that something was wrong with the duchess. He was puzzled because she had helped the baron and saved the knight who was about to be executed. The knights who missed the killer also somehow did not suffer punishment for their carelessness. It seemed to him that the duchess had lost her memory. The emperor understood that since she had forgotten about Eleanor, she most likely did not remember their contract. He understood that now was the time. The emperor understood that this was his last chance to get his mother back now. The margrave looked at the duchess with tears in his eyes and said that he was very glad that she had finally woken up. He looked at her intently and said that after the doctor's words his heart sank into his heels. The duchess in turn understood that she had vomited blood very badly, and it was surprising that she remained alive. She wondered if it was all because of her immunity. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he didn't know whether she would believe him or not, but he still said that he had nothing to do with it. Looking at him, she understood why he was so worried about her. The duchess in turn was tired of being polite and sighing heavily said that she believed him. He looked at her in surprise and asked if it was true, as he was very happy about this news. The duchess said that her death in this castle was only beneficial to one count, but it still made no sense. She looked closely at the man and asked what happened to those who touched the wine. Margravess said that they locked everyone in the basement. He looked at her intently and told her not to worry, because he would definitely find the culprit, even if he had to break a couple of ribs. Irina looked at him intently and told him to let everyone go right now. The man looked at her in bewilderment. He asked in surprise how they would then know who the criminal was. She looked at him intently and said with a grin that they should spread the rumor. She said that he must immediately tell everyone that the duchess was dead. Sometime later, the maids were whispering among themselves that the duchess was dead. They knew that someone had poisoned her. The maid asked her friends if they had not heard what the count had said. He said that if it became known that the duchess had died in the castle, then they would all go to their forefathers. The duchess sighed heavily as they finished whispering at the most interesting part. She decided to take a little walk because she was very bored, sitting in the room, and it was also very cold. She wanted something to eat. She thought for a moment because she didn't understand why she hadn't seen Carden since yesterday. She knew that he had disappeared right after that awkward conversation. She realized that he probably thought that she had forgotten about the contract. A moment later, she heard a noise and became alert. Turning around, she saw the emperor, who had brought her something to eat. He looked at her closely and said that he had thought she must look sick and exhausted, but he was still glad that it was not so. The duchess thanked him for the food. She looked at him closely as she noticed that he had changed somehow. The duchess looked at the emperor intently and asked if he would like to eat with her too. He looked at her angrily and asked if she was really offering him dog food. She sighed heavily as she now realized that it had only seemed to her that he had changed. At night, the emperor came to the duchess and told her to stop sleeping because they had to go. The duchess was surprised, looked at him and asked what was going on. The emperor said that they had to go somewhere. She looked at him in surprise and asked if they really had to set off right now. The emperor told the duchess that if he suddenly started wandering around the castle in broad daylight, people would have questions. The duchess was puzzled as it was very cold at night. The emperor looked at her sideways as it irritated him that she was shivering from the cold. A moment later, he threw the skin of the killed bear over her. The duchess was in shock. She looked at him intently and puzzled, thanked him, but still said that she did not need such a cape. A moment later, the emperor laughed. She looked at him in surprise but said nothing. A few minutes later, they approached the window. The emperor looked closely at the man who was heading somewhere in a hurry. He pointed at him and said that he thought he was the criminal. The duchess was surprised, for she knew that the man was the old butler who was always at the margrave's side. Carden with lightning speed took the young lady by the hand and said that they needed to immediately catch the criminal, but unfortunately they would not catch him up the stairs. She looked at him in surprise, but a moment later the emperor with the duchess in his arms jumped out of the window, and the duchess was very frightened and screamed in surprise. Before they had even set foot on the ground, the emperor with lightning speed took the skin from the duchess and threw it after the man. The duchess in turn was shocked by the emperor's actions and thought that he was just a crazy tyrant. The man turned around because he heard some noise, but before his eyes was a truly terrible picture. He screamed in fear. The man kneeling told the duchess that everything was built by the margrave, and the margrave in turn shouted that the man was lying. He looked at the duchess intently and said that it was simply impossible and he would never harm the duchess. The duchess stopped him and said that if the margrave was to blame for everything, then she did not understand why the man was trying to send a letter saying that she was dead. She looked at the man and said that he could have told him this personally. The man shouted, hesitating, that the margrave had connections with high-ranking aristocrats in the capital, and that was the whole reason. The margrave looked at the butler with fury and asked if he really decided to drag him along with him. The duchess saw that they were constantly quarreling and wondered why she had gotten herself into this situation. A moment later, the emperor entered the room and looked at everyone present with anger. He said it was very noisy. A moment later, everyone became quiet and silent. The emperor looked at the duchess and told her to look at these documents since the investigation was completed: false walls and boxes with double bottoms. The duchess looked closely at the documents and froze in shock. She was a little puzzled as she had smelled this smell before. She was now sure who was behind it. Sometime later there was a banquet in the imperial palace in the banquet hall. Everyone present was whispering among themselves as they could not believe that an official document had arrived, and it said that the duchess was dead. They were whispering among themselves as rumors said that she had been poisoned. They were very surprised as she drank wine as if it were water and died because of the wine. The man said with a grin that it sounded very ironic. A moment later, the emperor stepped into the banquet hall and looked intently at everyone present. He asked what they were talking about so enthusiastically. The aristocrats looked at the emperor in surprise, but still greeted him. The man said that in the morning, an official letter informed them of the duchess's death, and they were now talking about it. The emperor thought for a moment and said that this was very strange since he had heard something completely different. The emperor said that in that case it would be right to ask the duchess directly. The emperor glanced sideways at the door and asked the duchess which of them was right. A moment later, the duchess entered the banquet hall and said with a grin that the emperor was certainly right. Everyone froze in shock, not understanding what was going on at all. The marquis looked at the duchess in surprise and asked why she was here. The emperor looked at the duchess with a grin and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. He also asked if her trip had gone well. The duchess said that everything was correct, and thanks to the grace of His Majesty, no problems had arisen. She smiled and said that wherever she went, his valiant name was shed light, heaping compliments on him, and people shed tears and could not hide their admiration. She looked at them all intently and said that however she had experienced something unpleasant. The emperor looked at the duchess with excitement and told her to tell him everything in more detail. The duchess looked at everyone present and said that someone had tried to poison her. The emperor approached her in bewilderment and asked who had cured a hangover like that. The duchess said that the place where this happened was the Margraviate of Hesbon. Everyone began to whisper as they were not surprised that the margrave was guilty. They called him a jester who defended the border. They thought that perhaps he simply decided to vent his anger on the duchess. The marquis shouted to the emperor that this was an attempt to poison the prime minister of the empire, and he must immediately cut off his head and confiscate his lands. The emperor looked at the marquis with a grin and said that it had been a long time since their empire had seen a show with an execution. The margrave in turn shouted to the emperor that he was not a criminal. The margrave looked at the duchess in shock and shouted that she believed him. He did not understand why he was now the one being held accountable. The duchess in turn sighed heavily and said that the margrave had nothing to do with it. She said that her drink was poisoned by his butler. If the margrave really wanted to kill her, he would not have used his subordinates. She looked at everyone present and asked for 1 minute of their attention. She said that the butler had used this pigeon to communicate with the real criminal. He even tried to send a message on the day she was supposed to die. she said with a grin that, however, apparently everyone already knew about it. The man in turn shouted furiously that they had received an official letter yesterday. The Duchess said with a grin that everything was correct and it was all about the letter. She looked at them sharply and said that, however, the letter did not mention that she died as a result of drinking wine. She wondered how they knew about this in advance. The Duchess looked sharply at the Marquis. He looked at everyone present in surprise and asked in confusion why they were all looking at him. A moment later, everyone began to whisper as the Marquis was the first to speak about it. Everyone said that they thought that the Marquis had his own sources and that he had found out about everything in advance. The Marquis was very frightened. He asked if everyone suspected him. He shouted that it was simply absurd on their part. The Duchess looked closely at the Marquis and said that it was very ironic. She said with a grin that, however, even if the Marquess's words were not enough, the dove would serve as weighty evidence. The Marquis froze in shock. She looked at him and said that he was the author of the article about the Duchess's death and that it was he who spread the news. The dove flew near the Marquis, and the Marquis in turn was very angry and chased the dove away. The Duchess smiled and said that the note was covered with indelible paint. The Marquis froze in place in shock. The Duchess looked closely at the Marquis and asked with a grin if he could take off his gloves. The Marquis realized that he was in a hopeless situation, and with lightning speed, he rushed to the Duchess. He was furious and screamed that it was all because of her. But a moment later, the Emperor intercepted him and threw him to the ground. Carden looked at the Marquis intently and said that it would be absurd to deprive the Duchess of her head. A moment later, he nevertheless took off the Marquis's gloves and, sighing heavily, said that in the end the Duchess had been right. Everyone saw that the Marquis's hands were covered in paint, and the Emperor said that he was a criminal. Soon after the incident, the Marquis was executed. No one expected a reward for the work done. The Marquis had a personal grudge against the Duchess. The case of the poisoning of the Duchess was closed. The Duchess sighed heavily as she was very sorry that she had not managed to grab the Dowager Empress by the tail. Eden again, but she heard that he too had disappeared, leaving behind a huge debt. However, now she was a little worried as the Emperor was constantly by her side. She looked closely at the Emperor, for he was now of much greater concern to her than the Empress. She remembered his words, which he said that it would be absurd if the Duchess lost her head. She thought about his words for a very long time because she knew that one day he would definitely cut off her head. Irina would never have thought that the main character could behead her. She knew that she needed to prepare better right away since he was capable of anything. The young lady was very scared and worried. A moment later, the Emperor came closer to the Duchess and asked when she would allow him to meet Eleanor. The Duchess in turn froze in bewilderment. Since she did not understand what he was talking about, the Emperor looked at her intently and asked if they had not agreed that they would meet at her place. She was shocked as she knew nothing about her, but he was waiting for her help in meeting her. She looked at the Emperor and said that if this request of His Majesty, if not fulfilled, it would turn into an order. Irina said timidly that it might take a long time. The Emperor sighed heavily and said that he couldn't do anything about it. She froze in shock. Moments later, the Emperor said with a grin that in that case he would wait. The Emperor returned to his study and was absorbed in his thoughts. He realized that the Duchess had really lost her memory. But in turn, he wondered how much a person could change when he lost all his memories. He knew that according to the established directive, the Marquis should not have been executed immediately. His execution could have been much more cruel if, as a result, during the search for accomplices in the crime, the Emperor sighed heavily as he understood that everything was happening just as it had then. The Duchess was sitting quietly in her office and working when suddenly she heard a knock at the door. Opening the door, she saw a man. She looked at him in surprise and asked what had happened at such a late hour. The man sighed heavily and asked the Duchess for forgiveness, but said that His Majesty had ordered that she be brought to him urgently. The Duchess was a little puzzled and agitated as Carden had not called her at such a late hour. She wondered what he had in mind this time. As she followed the man, she noticed that they were heading towards the Emperor's bedroom. She was shocked and thought that this simply couldn't be happening. She knew that this was simply out of the question, since in the original, the Emperor never touched the Duchess. She, in turn, was very interested in whether another scenario awaited her. The man knocked on the door and told the emperor that he had brought the Duchess. Irina entered the room and greeted the emperor and also said that he had called her and she had come. She froze in place as she saw that the emperor was very relaxed and in revealing clothing. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really come. The Duchess was surprised. The emperor looked at her intently and told her to come closer to him. The Duchess was a little puzzled as she saw that the atmosphere was unusual. She slowly approached the emperor closer. The emperor gave the Duchess a radiant smile and said that she had been working herself to the point of exhaustion all this time, so he decided to console her personally. The Duchess stood frozen in place as she did not understand what he was saying. She wondered how exactly he was going to comfort her. But in turn, her mind told her that she needed to come to her senses since there is a good saying, "With a cool head, a tiger bite is not scary." She raised the question that it would be better for her to run away before it was too late. A moment later, she finally decided to get rid of the strange atmosphere that was hanging around. She knew that it was time for her to unleash the Korean office plankton skills that she had honed over the years. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she could not believe that His Majesty had acknowledged her efforts. She said that she would try to express her devotion in proportion to His grace. Irina was very pleased with herself as she understood that her body still remembered its old skills. The emperor looked at her in surprise and asked what had come over her. He sighed heavily and said that he just wanted to have a drink with her, but she started acting strange. He said that she must definitely take responsibility for this. She looked at him in surprise and said that, of course, she would take responsibility. Irina said with a smile that it would be a great honor for her to drink with him. Carden looked at her intently and said that for every word he said, he would pour her 1 glass. Sometime later, Duchess Tired was sitting at the table. The emperor looked intently at the Duchess. He said that on such days he thinks of Eleanor. The Duchess looked at the emperor in bewilderment as she did not understand what he was talking about. He sighed heavily and said that it had been a long time since he had told her the story of the young lady. The emperor came closer to her and asked if she would like to hear some stories. The emperor, looking at the Duchess, said that Eleanor was a beautiful person. All light chestnut hair her eyes were, the same color as the Duchess's. Her expression was gentle and her smile even more gentle. The Duchess looked at the emperor intently and said with a smile that she would like to meet her one day. A moment later, the Duchess fell on the emperor and fell asleep. The emperor, in turn, was very much shocked by the Duchess's actions. He froze in place looking at her. The Duchess woke up in the morning screaming that she simply didn't believe it. She was shocked and furious with herself as she realized that in recent days she could often become emotional and behave stupidly. Irina saw her own things on the floor and cursed. She was in shock and wondered what happened last night. She was furious because she didn't remember anything because of the alcohol. A moment later, the emperor approached her with a grin and said that it was a pity that she did not remember anything. He looked closely at the Duchess and asked with a grin if she had changed her mind after that night. The Duchess was in shock. She wondered what she had been doing that night. Looking away from the emperor, she said that she remembered everything very well. She understood that she needed to survive first of all, especially if she was doing something with the tyrant. He looked at her intently and said with a grin that he was very glad because he liked everything. The emperor said with a grin that he was looking forward to their next night. The young lady was shocked and froze looking at the emperor. She understood that the whole plot had gone in one place. The raven in turn cawed very loudly. Carden looked at the raven and said that everything was fine since nothing had happened. He knew that she was so hungover that she had forgotten how she had undressed in front of him, and he was only teasing her to see her reaction. The emperor was puzzled because he realized that being drunk she had not told him anything. He thought that apparently she really did not know anything about his mother. The emperor asked the raven if he was really suggesting sending the Duchess somewhere else. He thought that this was exactly what needed to be done since even if there were no clues left, there was still a chance to find leads. He understood that first they needed to get the Duchess out of the palace. The Duchess in turn knew that before she went into exile, she would definitely take revenge on the emperor. She was very upset about what happened last night. He entrusted her with the inauguration since he himself was too lazy. She knew that it was very good that she had left the palace under the pretext of a ceremony. She understood that if she had stayed there, she would certainly have gone mad. Sometime later, she looked intently at the priest as he said that after the prayer they would begin the dedication ceremony. The priest, looking at everyone present, conducted the ceremony. She saw the beautiful ceremony and how they lit the candles. Everyone present was a little surprised and puzzled as they understood that the high priest was leaving them. The duchess looked at everyone present in surprise. She did not understand what had happened to the atmosphere. A moment later, the priest said that the duchess's speech awaited them next. The young lady was in shock as she couldn't believe she was about to give a speech. She had never even given a speech before. She wondered if she would just overwhelm everyone with generalities. The duchess looked at everyone closely and said that she congratulated them from the bottom of her heart on the appointment of the new high priest. She hoped that in the future, God would take care of every inhabitant of the empire. She said that since the former high priest had given up his position, he could now enjoy a comfortable life free from obligations. She looked at everyone with a smile and gave a wonderful speech, but people were shocked. They did not understand how she could even bring herself to say something like that. They discussed her speech and said that they could not have expected anything else from her. The young lady was shocked. She froze, looking at everyone present, and wondered if she had said too much. A moment later, she saw the high priest who was in his place. She noticed that he was smiling as he looked at her. The high priest smiled and thanked the duchess. He smiled and said that he had never had the opportunity to hear such a speech before, and it made his heart feel lighter. The priest looked hard at the duchess and thanked her for coming that day. She looked hard at him and said that he had no need to thank her, for despite her lack of skill in words, she was grateful that he had listened to the end. He looked at her intently and said that she had not visited the temple for a long time and asked if she would like to look at the candles that he had given her. The duchess stood frozen in place as she did not understand what he was talking about. She wondered if the duke was really that religious. A moment later, the priest said that they had arrived at the place. The young lady looked around the room amazed by its beauty. The priests looked sideways at the duchess and said that her candles were nearby. The duchess looked closely at the candle. She noticed that it was very small and cute. The young lady in turn understood that the spontaneous and unpredictable duchess was now on the air. The priest smiled and said that among the candlesticks here, the nobleman had lit only the duke's candle. She looked at the priest in surprise and asked why this was so. He looked at her intently and said that perhaps it was connected with the tale of the ham, personifying the owner's life, and when it went out, it took his life with it. The duchess froze in shock. The priest looked at the young lady and laughed. He looked at her and said that it was just a story and she didn't need to worry. He said with a smile that even a gust of wind could not extinguish a candle preserved by God. He looked at her closely and said he thought it had something to do with the myth that a candle grows dim as its owner approaches death. He said there had never been a single case where it had been deliberately extinguished. She looked at him in surprise and asked if the high priest's candle had not been extinguished at the ceremony today. He looked at her intently and said that when the high priest leaves his office after a few days, he must go to God. The duchess was shocked and froze in place from the priest's words. Now she understood perfectly well why her speech shocked people so much. She realized that she was veiled. She wished him to leave the world as soon as possible. She, the priest, she said in a trembling voice that she had not quite meant it during her congratulatory speech. He smiled and said that everything was fine, as he had said earlier, and was saying now that he felt relief after her. He looked at the duchess intently and said that he was now curious. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He said that people trusting their lives to God and lighting a candle are most often driven by despair. He asked what feelings she experienced at that moment. At the same time, the emperor carefully tore through all the documents in the duchess's office. She looked at the priest closely and said that she understood why he asked that, but unfortunately she did not remember. The emperor sighed heavily, looking at the raven. He said that even after losing her memory, the duchess remained a duchess. He was amazed that no one noticed any changes. A moment later, Carden noticed a secret lock. He was surprised and tried to open it, but nothing worked. A moment later, he heard the duchess's voice and froze in shock. The duchess was surprised. She wondered if she hadn't locked her room. She walked slowly into her office and looked around. Irina slowly approached the birds and asked with a smile why they were so angry again. She looked at the birds in surprise and asked if someone had already entered the room and pestered them. The emperor was puzzled as the duchess returned very early and he did not have enough time to search. He understood that he had to come up with a reason and drive her out of the castle. He looked at the duchess intently and said that he had called her today because he wanted to have a glass of wine. She looked at him puzzled, but didn't answer. She was shocked because he had made her wait for a very long time just to drink wine. In turn, she almost called him names, but stopped herself in time. She said with a smile that she would definitely call someone right away. He looked at her intently and said that there was no need for that since he had something completely different in mind. He said that he wanted to drink some old wine, which must be about 300 years old. The duchess looked at him puzzled and asking for forgiveness, said that she was sure that there was no wine of such age in the palace. He said puzzled that in this spacious castle there was no wine that he wanted and did not know. What should he do now and how to console himself? The duchess suddenly remembered that night when he said he wanted to comfort her. She looked at him intently and shouted that she would search the entire continent for him and find 300-year-old wine. He was very glad that his plan had succeeded. The count looked hard at the duchess and said that he had heard that she had been looking for him. The duchess greeted the count. He asked if she had really been looking for him since he had not yet paid his taxes. He asked her in a trembling voice for a little time as he would soon pay for everything. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand why he suddenly mentioned taxes. She thought that it was the duchess who did something to him. She looked at the count intently and said that he had no need to worry unnecessarily, as she had called him for another reason. The count in turn sighed heavily as he was glad that he had not been called for that reason. She looked at him intently and said that she wanted to ask him for cooperation, as she needed to send someone to a distant land of their country. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she wanted to do so. The duchess said she had something to find. She looked at the count and said that his business had made a good impression on her. The count was shocked. He smiled and said that he did not understand how deep her words were. She said that she thought she could send a few people and she would go there herself. The count looked at the duchess in surprise and timidly said that he did not know that the duchess was interested in shipping. The duchess looked at the count intently and said that she was not attracted to him. He looked at her in surprise as he did not understand why she was acting this way in this situation. She smiled and said that she wanted to help His Majesty, so she was knowledgeable in a variety of areas. A few months later, the duchess set sail. The man shouted and announced to everyone that he had found something the duchess looked intently out to see. The men present were amazed as the duchess's words turned out to be true that a shipwreck had occurred on the spot. The duchess slowly opened the bag and saw excellent wine. She looked closely at the bottle and realized that it suited her perfectly. She saw that the cork was strong and the wine remained in good condition. She understood that it was worth several months of travel. She looked at the men and thanked them for their good work and said that if they could get the rest, she would give them a coin for each item. They were amazed at what they heard and said that they would definitely get everything right away. The count looked at the young lady with surprise and bewilderment and asked how she knew about the ship with such valuable wine. She smiled but said nothing. She knew she simply couldn't explain that she had simply fallen into an affair. She knew it was simply impressive and she was privileged. In the history of the novel, only the existence of this ship was mentioned, but unfortunately the exact location was not given. Having only this valuable clue, she was able to gather information and determine the location of the ship with 300-year-old wine. The young lady smiled and said that if he worked in this field, he would be able to learn everything in the world. He looked at her intently and said that he wanted it to remain only between them and asked if he could take at least one bottle of this wine. The duchess smiled and said that she had heard that his daughter had a coming-of-age party, and on that occasion she would give him the bottle herself. She was puzzled as she had not interacted with the nobility for several months. The count thanked her for the honor. She smiled and said that his daughter must be very beautiful since she looked like him. He smiled and said that there were attacks since she was a child with light brown hair. The duchess froze in place from shock. Irina knew that the emperor really liked girls with light brown hair. She wondered what would happen if she introduced the young lady to the emperor. Irina knew that he would immediately forget about her. The young lady understood that this was an opportunity that was simply sent to her by heaven. The duchess sighed heavily, looking at the count. She said that she had a lot of worries lately. She said that the pillars of the empire must be strong for the country to recover, but His Majesty has not yet made up his mind and often changes his mind. She said that the emperor was famous for having many affairs. He looked at her with bewilderment and asked why she mentioned that. She looked at him and said with a smile that for that reason she thought his daughter could help her with His Majesty, and at this rate he would settle down. The count was simply shocked by such a question. He asked what she was even talking about. The duchess looked at the men and told them to pack up the remaining bottles and send them to the palace. She said that they had to do it without anyone knowing. The men bowed obediently and said that they would do everything. The duchess turned around and looked at the people present. She said that there were several more ships like this, and compensation would be taken care of. They didn't have to worry about anything. She looked at them intently and said that if today's events became public knowledge, they would be in trouble. They fell to their knees with lightning speed and said that they would remain silent. They begged for mercy. The duchess was shocked because she just wanted to ask them to keep it a secret. She knew perfectly well that they were afraid of the duchess, not her, but the duchess. But she wondered why it upset her so much. Sometime later, the duchess attended a celebration at the imperial castle. A moment later, she saw the count, who was glowing. He looked at his daughter with a smile and introduced her to the duchess. The young lady looked at the duchess intently and said with a smile that she was very glad to welcome her. The duchess in turn was struck to the depths of her soul by such beauty and the beautiful smile of the young lady. She was shocked because she realized that the girl was even more beautiful than she imagined, and she matched the emperor's taste. She was a little puzzled because she felt as if she was in control of her life. The lady looked at the duchess intently and said that she was very excited when she heard the news from her father. She said with a radiant smile that she would become the first lady, His Majesty. The duchess was shocked by the young lady. The duchess looked at the girl intently and said that, to be honest, she would not be the first lady, but the young lady in turn did not hear anything. She said with a smile that she had admired the emperor since childhood. She did not know whether it was a dream. The count approached the duchess and quietly said that his daughter had become obsessed with the emperor when she saw his face. The duchess in turn wondered if a handsome face and character were important aspects for her. She looked at the count intently and said that if he did not want his daughter to become the emperor's concubine, then he should tell her about it since she was not forcing her to do it. The count said that he could not do this since marrying His Majesty was the dream of her whole life. The count looked at the duchess intently and asked if he could ask her for a favor. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He said that she was the only one who had spent a lot of time near the emperor. She knew that, in fact, this was not true. He looked at her and said that she should know His Majesty's preferences better than anyone else. The duchess looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She looked at the count intently and asked if he was really asking her that now. The count in turn said that he was, and asked her to give his daughter a bridal lesson. The emperor in turn sat at the banquet and closely watched all the guests. He was very puzzled as everyone was irritating him today. He made the duchess leave the palace, but unfortunately he found nothing that could find his mother, and the box with a false bottom contained only books. He was furious and wanted something to drink. A moment later, the duchess approached the emperor and asked for forgiveness for being late. She greeted the son of the empire with a radiant smile. He looked at the duchess in surprise but froze in place. The duchess heard the guests whispering. They wondered if she really was leaving the capital to carry out the emperor's order. They were amazed since the emperor had ordered her to find a 300-year-old wine. All those present were amazed by such an order and wondered if it would have been better to just die than to carry out this order. She saw the emperor looking at her with a grin. He asked her with a grin if she was going to have wine. He asked if she had to leave him today. The duchess smiled and said that satisfying the needs of their emperor was her only goal in life. She said with a smile that she wanted to give him the wine that he so ardently desired. The duchess in turn was very pleased with herself as she invited designers to fully reveal the beauty of the young lady. She knew that they had dressed her in such a dress to highlight all her advantages. But a moment later, she froze looking at the emperor. She didn't understand why he was looking at her so intently. She glanced sideways at the young lady, wishing he would look at her too. The young lady looked at the Duchess intently and quietly asked if she could pour wine for His Majesty. Now the Duchess smiled and gave the young lady the go-ahead. The young lady in turn slowly approached the Emperor and poured him a glass of fine wine. The Emperor took his time tasting the fine wine, he said with a smile that, as expected, the Duchess had not disappointed him, and he had tasted the best wine in his life. The young lady froze in place. She saw his radiant smile and wondered if he liked the wine. She understood that now was the time to talk to him. She looked at the Emperor intently and asked if she could say something. The Emperor looked at the Duchess intently and said that he was very pleased and she could feel free to speak. The Duchess said that as someone who is a subject of the Emperor, when she sees the empty rooms of the imperial palace, she feels ashamed and feels that she is not loyal enough to him. Everyone froze in place as they could not believe what she was about to say. She looked at the Emperor intently and said with a smile that for this reason she would like to introduce the Count's daughter to him as a concubine. She said that she would like him to resolve the issue of the heir. The Emperor in turn looked at the Duchess with fury, and at that very moment the glass of wine in his hand cracked. Everyone present was shocked. They began to whisper furiously among themselves as they understood that the imperial family needed an heir and His Majesty rejected the marriage. But still looking at the Duchess, they wondered whether everything would be different if it were the Duchess who said it. The Emperor looked at the young lady with anger and said that if such were the words of the Duchess, then it was a different matter. The young lady in turn was very frightened. He looked at the Duchess with a grin and asked if he should trust her again. The Duchess looked at the young lady closely and asked her if she remembered what she had told her. The young lady smiled and said that she would certainly take action. The Duchess looked at her closely and told her not to forget culture, dignity, and manners. She told the lady not to forget everything she had been taught, and she needed to be honest with her words and feelings. The young lady, with a mischievous smile, said that she would remember all of it. The Emperor in the original story was not interested in modest women. He did not prevent people from coming into his life and leaving it. She thought that Cardan wanted easy and comfortable relationships. She knew that words about eternal love meant nothing to such a person. The young lady took the Duchess by the hands and with a smile told her not to worry so much as she would certainly cope with everything. The Duchess looked at the young lady in surprise but said nothing. She understood that if the Emperor had eyes, he would not be able to let such a beauty pass him by. That's exactly what she thought, but unfortunately, everything went wrong. The Emperor was furious. He stood and waited for the Duchess. A moment later, the Duchess burst into the Emperor's room. She was shocked by what she saw and did not understand what the noise was. Irina looked at the Emperor and wondered how he could hurt a young lady even if he was a tyrant. The Emperor looked at the Duchess intently and said with a grin that he had trusted in the Duchess's insight, but he was unfortunately disappointed. A moment later, she bowed with lightning speed and said she was very sorry. She said that she had failed to help him properly and that even the death penalty would not be enough for her. She looked timidly at the Emperor and asked if she could ask him a question. She was interested in what could have offended him. She saw that the young lady was very upset. The maid looked at the lady and told her to stop crying because if she didn't leave now, she would be in big trouble. The Duchess looked at the Emperor intently and timidly asked what rudeness the young lady had committed against him. He said with fury that the woman had tried to kill him. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Duchess was furious and wondered what the Count was planning. He looked at the Duchess intently and asked from whom the young lady had taken her bridal lessons. He said that he had never seen such a furious woman before. The Duchess looked at the Emperor in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Emperor slowly began to approach the Duchess. In all seriousness, he said that the woman had tried to bite him. He came closer to the Duchess and said that he would show her now. The young lady was shocked. She wondered if the Emperor had kicked the young lady out because she tried to kiss him. He looked at her with a smirk and said that it was really unfortunate, as he liked the clothes and her appearance. She understood that it was natural as she was trying to make her suit his taste. The Emperor looked at the Duchess intently and said with a smile that he liked her clothes because they reminded him of that night. The duchess in turn was very angry since she had completely forgotten about the night she spent with the emperor. He came closer to her and asked her with a smile why she was wearing those ugly glasses. He said that he really liked the way she looked now. The young lady in turn was shocked by what she heard. She looked at the emperor with embarrassment. A moment later she pushed him away. The emperor was shocked as he did not expect this. The duchess said that it was late and she should go. As she left, Irina glanced sideways at the emperor and said that she would investigate the lady's case. The emperor, in turn, froze in place in shock as he did not expect such a thing. The count looked at the duchess with tears in his eyes and asked what murder they were talking about. He shouted that his daughter could not have committed such a thing. He shouted that she was set up. The count fell to his knees and shouted that his daughter was just a child who adored His Majesty very much. He looked at the duchess intently and said that he had not meant to be rude last time. The count said that during the meeting the emperor had been unable to concentrate and had dozed off, and he had also asked about the duchess's work. The count looked at the duchess intently and said that alcohol had been served at the banquet, which was not to His Majesty's taste. The young lady was shocked. She thought that this simply could not be. She looked at the count intently and wondered if he thought she had built all of this. She was puzzled because she had not been able to bring her plans to life. She looked at the count and said that she was not stupid at all and was not delighted with it either. She said that he should wait until everything calmed down and she would certainly explain the whole situation to the emperor. He looked at the duchess intently and said that she had liked his ship last time and that it just so happened that she had a brand new vessel. She smiled and said that this could work. The young lady in turn understood that it was possible to go to another country on a ship, and this was a good chance for survival. She looked closely at the count and called him. The young lady looked at the count with a smile and asked if they should sign the contract right now. Sometime later, all the aristocrats were gathered before the emperor. The count in turn was shaking very much with fear. The duchess glanced sideways at the count. She was puzzled as she had hastily agreed to the ship. Looking at the emperor, she understood that if he decided to punish the count, she was not sure that she would be able to establish it. She understood that the count was probably busy with ideas on how to save his life. She understood that since the emperor had not said anything, she was very excited and did not know what would happen next. She looked at the emperor intently and said that at the end of the agenda, she would like to raise the issue of yesterday's scandal with the count. The emperor looked at her intently and asked if she really wanted to talk about the woman who dared to attack her. She said with a smile that this act was unforgivable and required punishment. The duchess said with a smile that, however, what had happened last night had not been an attempt to harm His Majesty. She said that an excess of emotion with a lack of etiquette had led to such consequences. He looked at her intently and said that perhaps if you took away all manners from a person he would turn into a wild animal. She was furious because it looked to her as if he was talking about himself. But she in turn wondered who she was. But the answer came to her with lightning speed, for she knew that she was a sycophant, that she was fawning over his meaningless phrases. She looked intently at the emperor and said that it was all her fault. She said that the count's daughter, who usually behaved calmly, suddenly became an elemental fury. And it was all her fault, since she did not check it beforehand. Everyone was amazed by what they heard. She looked at the emperor intently and said that he must have just been confused by what was happening. The duchess said that she, in order to further strengthen her words, would dedicate herself to this. She said that she would definitely find a concubine who would be a human being and not a beast. The duchess looked at the young lady and asked for forgiveness. She said that unfortunately she could not help anymore. The young lady looking at the duchess said that she had done even more than she could. The duchess looked at the young lady intently. She was shocked. She couldn't believe how the emperor could do this to a young, beautiful lady who looked like an early flower. She was furious because she knew he was mocking her even in her thoughts. The duchess looked at the young lady intently and said that if she liked anyone, she should not hesitate to tell her about it, and she would definitely help her. The young lady thanked the duchess. The young lady looked at the duchess intently and asked her to take good care of His Majesty. The duchess looked at the lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The young lady in turn looked intently at the duchess. She was trembling and tears rolled down her face. She said that since the emperor had a duchess next to her, she would just give up. The young lady said these words and ran away like lightning. The Duchess was shocked and shouted at her to stop. Irina was in shock on the spot. She didn't understand what had just happened and what she was even talking about. The Count looked at the Duchess and thanked her with a smile. Since she had helped him so much, he asked how he could repay her. He said that she had helped him avoid punishment and also prevented his daughter from becoming a concubine. He said that he would be devoted to her all his life. The Duchess sighed heavily and said that he was free to do as he wished. She said that she knew that in any other outcome, he would have stabbed her in the back. The Earl was shocked. He looked closely at the young lady and asked her to believe him since he was speaking sincerely. She sighed heavily and said that she believed him. The Duchess looked closely at the Count and said that if he really wanted to repay her, then there was one way. He looked at the Duchess with surprise and joy and asked what method she wanted to offer him. She looked at him intently and said that she wanted to talk to him about the slave trade. He stood there surprised and confused as he was in shock. The Duchess looked at the Count intently and asked with a grin if he could introduce her to the slave trader. The Count was trembling with fear. He said that the slave trade was illegal and he knew nothing about it, but the Duchess, in turn, knew perfectly well that he was aware of everything that was happening. She knew that he was on friendly terms with the Marquis, a big shot in the slave market. This was written in detail in the Duchess's notebook. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that he had no need to be afraid, since she too was interested in the slave market. The Count said timidly that this might reach the ears of His Majesty. She looked at him intently and said that she could give him her word that such a thing would not happen. The Duchess said that if the Marquis was caught, she would immediately announce that his daughter was a concubine, as she was considering her as the Emperor's next concubine. The men looked at the Duchess and thanked her for accepting the invitation. The Duchess smiled and said that she had not had any free time lately because she had been busy with state affairs, but she was truly touched that they had gathered here so quickly. The Marquis smiled and said that if the Duchess was looking for him, he should be here in a minute. The Duchess in turn understood that this was not surprising, since the followers of the late Emperor, the Marquis, were also hostile to the Duchess. The young lady understood that the Duchess had pushed the Emperor aside and created many problems by taking the central place of power. She read about it all in the Duchess's notes. The Duchess looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she would like to thank the lady for taking this opportunity to come to them. The young lady said that she was very glad to be here with them. The Duchess looked at everyone present and said that she did not know if they had heard, but she could certainly recommend the Marquis's daughter for the role of His Majesty's concubine. The Marquis looked at the Duchess in surprise and asked if the situation became worse than with the Count's daughter, would she take responsibility for it. The Duchess sighed heavily and told the Marquis that he should not worry about it. The Duchess said that His Majesty was looking for a calm and balanced woman, and she thought that was why his choice fell on the Marquis's daughter. The Marquis thought for a moment and said that his daughter was quite calm. The Duchess said that she could not look after His Majesty alone forever, as she also needed to focus on the affairs of the duchy. The Marquis asked if this meant that she was considering marriage. The Duchess said that there was a slight problem with the succession to the duchy. The Marquis thought for a moment and said that it was true. He looked at her closely and said that she was already of age to start a family. She said that before that, she was thinking about making up for all the time she had wasted on the ducal routine with some worthy entertainment. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she meant. A moment later, he understood everything and asked with a grin how he could help her. The young lady looked at the man intently as she was glad that he understood everything. She in turn understood that the ice had broken very quickly. She looked at him intently and with a grin said that there was someone he could introduce to her. The Marquis brought the young Duchess to the meeting place and said that in this establishment it was necessary to maintain anonymity, and he asked her not to forget to put on a mask before entering. The young lady in turn looked intently at the Marquis and thanked him for his concern. A moment later they were slowly descending. Entering the room, the Duchess froze in place in shock. Irina saw how they treated the people they called slaves. She understood that she should not show her true feelings. She understood that it was still too early since her goal was to get rid of this slave market. The rest looked at the man and told the Duchess that he was the owner of the slave market they had talked about earlier. Due to the nature of the job, he might seem a little rude. but he was still a very reliable person. The man looked at the duchess intently and asked if the duchess herself had really decided to meet with such a simple man as he. The young lady was surprised because she realized that he actually knew who she was. She realized that she could save time and get to the point. She looked at the man closely and said that she wanted a share of this market. Irina said that he needed to give the share to her, and she would help make the slave market legal. Everyone present was shocked by such a statement. The marquise looked at the duchess with surprise and bewilderment and asked if she was sure of this. The young lady in turn knew that this was not so and wondered whether it was worth doing. She knew she had no better bait to obtain the books and move the slaves. She knew he was just a ruthless merchant blinded by money who kidnapped and sold people. She wondered if he could refuse her offer. The man looked at the young lady intently and said that he refused the offer. The duchess and the marquise were shocked by the refusal. The marquis approached the man and asked him why he was refusing this offer. He asked him if he didn't understand what a wonderful opportunity this was. The man in turn said that he was sure that the marquis could act freely, but it was very risky for him. The young lady in turn understood that there was meaning in his words, but unfortunately she could not simply let go of this situation. She knew that the tyrant was destined to fall in love with the princess, and the war between the two countries was just a matter of time. She understood that in this case, stopping the slave rebellion during the war would give her some time and she could escape from this palace. She looked at the men and said she wanted to offer them 1 billion. They froze in shock. She looked at them intently and said that as a sign of her sincerity, she would invest 1 billion. The duchess looked at them intently and asked what they would say and if that would be enough. The man said with a grin that it was too much money for him to manage. He looked at the duchess and thanked her for her interest in his little business, but unfortunately it was only suitable for such a low-grade market. The young lady was shocked, as it seemed very strange to her. She did not understand why he suddenly rejected such a profitable offer for himself. The marquis quietly whispered and asked his friend if he had really gone crazy. The duchess looked at the man closely, wondering if it was possible that he wanted more than just money. She was sure that there was definitely someone behind him. She looked at him intently and said that since he had decided so, they could meet another time. She looked at the man intently and said that she would then have a chance to bargain. The man looked closely at the young lady and agreed with her. The marquise looked at the duchess with a smile and said that Pos did not know about business. The marquis said with a smile that he would do his best to convince him. The duchess said that there was no need for that. She looked at the marquis intently and said that the man was not a subject of the empire since he was from Esland. She knew that he must have some ulterior motive for going to the empire to set up a slave market. The duchess looked at the marquis intently and said that if he did not want her to imprison him for treason, he had better stop this activity. She sighed heavily and asked if he interfered because of the development of the mine. The marquis looked at her in surprise and asked in shock how she knew about it. She said that she would send all the prisoners to the estate and restore the status of slaves. He was surprised and said that if she would do this for him, he would be immensely grateful, and also said that he understood her. She looked at him intently and said that she was not doing this for nothing. There was something that he could do for her. He looked at her intently and said that of course he was willing to help her. She looked at him intently and told him to keep an eye on Pos immediately. She said that he should keep in touch with him and should get information on where he gets the slaves from, where the money from the sales goes, and even who he is dating. Irina said that she should know about everything. The young lady in turn knew that for now they could stop there and move on to the next step. A moment later, she heard some noise as one of the slaves was shouting that he didn't like it and was screaming very loudly to be let go. The girl screamed with tears in her eyes and asked where her brother was. The marquis looked at the duchess intently and said quietly that the Arab had rebelled, as this happened very often here. The young lady was shocked and cursed the slave market. The duchess froze in place as she saw the slave hit those who were holding him. The man screamed that the slave had escaped. The man screamed and called the guard for help. The duchess stood frozen in place, staring at the whole situation. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. She wondered, looking at the man, if this was not Mr. Eden. A moment later, guards rushed into the room furious that the slave had rebelled. They attacked him, but he easily fought them all off. The man stepped back in fear and shouted at the slave not to come near him. The man was very scared and asked what the guards were doing in this situation. Aiden looked at the man with fury and said that he promised that if he stayed here, he would let Katrina go. But a moment later, the guard hit the man on the back and he fell to the ground with a crash. A moment later, they twisted his arms and used physical force against him. Eden was furious. He screamed to be let go immediately. He looked at the man with fury and hatred and said that they had agreed on something else. The man angrily pushed Eden K towards his sister and ordered him to shut his mouth. The man looked at everyone present with a smile and asked if they had seen how strong the guy was. The man said that the slave would succeed in everything if he was trained well. He looked at everyone present and said with a grin that they could now begin the auction. The Marquis looked closely at the Duchess and asked if she was uncomfortable. The Duchess looked at the Marquis with a puzzled expression and said that everything was fine, they were just underground, so she felt sick for a moment. He looked at her closely and said that it seemed that sometimes people like that appeared here. She knew she needed to calm down if the Duchess showed any doubt, or was shocked they might become suspicious of this situation. Irina knew this man had tried to kill her twice. She wondered how she would be any different from the real Duchess if she pretended not to know him now. The man smiled at the people present and said that they could start with 1,000. He asked them to raise their hand and name the amount if anyone wanted to place a bet. A moment later, the Duchess took a step forward and said with a grin that it was the most interesting sight she had seen in a long time. She looked at everyone present with a grin and said that she had been bored lately, but she wanted to have some fun here. A moment later, everyone present began to whisper as they learned that the woman was the real Duchess. They were shocked as she was barely recognizable, and everyone was amazed by the fact that she had come to the slave market herself. The Duchess looked closely at the young men and said with a grin that she would buy these slaves. She looked at the man and said that her bet was 100 million for both of them and she could pay the whole amount at once. The man looked at the Duchess intently and said with a smile that in front of her now was Eden Noxus, who is 26 years old, and Katrina Noxus, who is 20 years old. The man looked at the young man intently and said that she would now be his mistress and he must serve her well. The Duchess was surprised and looked at the young man in bewilderment. She knew that it was Noxus, who upon learning of the death of his younger sister, who had been sold into slavery, rebelled. It was he who led the slave rebellion. He became a master of the sword because he had talent. He was fueled by anger. It was he who contributed to the collapse of the empire. The Duchess was shocked as she understood that he was a very important figure. The man looked at her intently and said that even if she changed her mind, he could not cancel the deal. She looked at him with fury and said that she had no intention of changing her mind. She looked at him and handed him the money, saying that it was the entire amount. The man took the money and left with lightning speed. Eden looked at the Duchess intently and called her, calling her mistress. The Duchess was surprised. He looked at her intently and asked if he could ask her for something. She was shocked that he called her mistress in that state, and with that expression on his face, she knew she had to pull herself together. The Duchess looked at him intently and asked what he wanted to ask her. She said that she would listen to him. Eden looked at the Duchess intently and said that his sister had nothing to do with it. Since she was in this situation because of her elder brother, the girl screamed and called for her brother. Eden sighed heavily, and without looking at the Duchess said that he was not asking her to forgive him for his past mistakes. He said that he could face death. Bowing, he asked her to let his sister go. The Duchess in turn understood that he thought she had bought him for her own revenge. She understood that given the Duchess's bad reputation, he was prepared to risk his life. She looked at him intently and said that she understood him and she would also restore his sister's status. He looked at her in surprise and confusion. A moment later, he thanked the Duchess with relief and said that he would repay her even if it meant he had to die. She understood that they were not guilty of anything and wanted to tell him not to call her mistress when they returned. A moment later, she felt a gaze on her. She looked at the Marquis in surprise and asked why he was looking at her so intently. The Marquis smiled and said that it was because today she was completely different, since she listened to every request of the slave. She looked intently at the Marquis and said with a smile that everything was obvious. She looked at those present and asked with a grin who she would be if she couldn't fulfill the request of her future lover. She understood that this was a blatant lie, but still, They had to get out of this situation somehow. The marquess looked at the duchess with a grin. He was surprised that she was going to use the guy for such a purpose. He said with a smile that he did not expect her to have such preferences. The duchess in turn knew that this was not the case, but she never thought that she would say such a thing. The emperor looked closely at his raven and asked what it had just told him. Carden was shocked as he looked at the raven, wondering why she suddenly started acting like this. The emperor was puzzled as he realized that the duchess had made Eden her lover. The duchess looked at the young man and said that she would like to ask him directly. She asked why he had tried to kill her then. Eden said that it all happened because of debt. Since his father was crazy about gambling, he began to spend all his money on it. Eden said that in the end, his father risked everything and even his sister, but unfortunately, he lost everything. He looked at the duchess intently and said that the man who had taken his sister had said that he must sell Catherine into slavery to pay off the debt or kill the duchess. Eden said that he failed, and he and his sister ended up in slavery. Irina looked at him with fury and said that she gave him a chance. Irina asked why he didn't tell her anything. He looked at her closely and said that he had eyes too. He asked how he could trust her. He sighed heavily and said that he knew those rumors were not true, but he never thought that the duchess would help him. Eden said he thought that if he returned, he would be interrogated and certainly executed. She, in turn, understood that the real duchess would not care, and he would immediately lose his head. She sighed heavily, and P asked permission to ask one question. She looked at the young man intently and asked if it was the dowager empress who wanted her dead. Eden looked at the duchess intently and said that it was not so. A moment later, he said it was Paws the slave trader. The empress dowager, who targeted the duchess from Esland, the slaver who tried to kill her, was also from there. The war with Esland was mentioned in the original story, and even the slave rebellion started at such a time. She thought that all this happened because the emperor brought a princess to the empire, but now everything was clear to her. Irina was furious at the realization that everything, including the war with Esland and the slave rebellion, even the fall of the empire, was all carefully planned by the dowager empress. The duchess walked slowly, but suddenly she felt dizzy. She sighed heavily as she realized that she had been very overexerted lately. Eden ran to the duchess and asked, puzzled, if she was okay. The duchess looked at him in surprise and called him out of habit. He looked at her intently and said that he was no longer the commander of the knights, and she could call him a slave without any formalities. She looked at him in surprise and said that slavery was prohibited by law. He sighed heavily and said that he understood everything, but she could still call him by his first name. The young lady smiled and agreed with him. The duchess looked at the young man closely and said that she would provide him with financial support so that he could leave here and start a new life with his sister. He looked at her intently and said that he didn't want it. The duchess looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Eden S. looked at the duchess and said that he only wished for his sister's status to be restored, and he in turn promised that he would repay her debt even at the cost of his own life. He looked at her intently and said that he was not lying to her at all. Eden, looking at the duchess, said that perhaps she could not trust him since he was a traitor, but this time he really wanted to give her an oath of allegiance. The duchess looked at the young man with a puzzled expression and said that there was no need for that. She in turn understood that such words sounded beautiful, but it would create an additional problem that would need to be solved. A moment later, the duchess thought for a moment as she knew that she had no people she could trust. She knew very well that she would not be able to get rid of the slave market on her own. She looked closely at the young man as she understood that in order to sort out this issue properly, she needed someone who would always be there. She looked at him intently and said that she understood his feelings. She asked with a smile if he would always be by her side as her assistant. The young man looked at the duchess in surprise as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked closely at the radiant smile she gave him. Taking the duchess by the hand, he thanked her shyly and also said that he would be her assistant. The young lady in turn looked intently at the young man. She wondered if his face had always been so charming. She looked at him sharply and said that they could call it a day. A moment later, the emperor approached them. He looked at the duchess with puzzlement and asked if she had really given him the position of assistant. He said that her affection for her lover was exclusive. The duchess looked at Carden in surprise. She looked at the emperor intently, as she did not expect to see him. The emperor looked at her with fury and asked if she could be stolen for a minute. A moment later, they were walking slowly into the office, the emperor letting the duchess go ahead so that she could enter first. After the duchess had left, the emperor pressed her against the door and angrily told her to stop interfering in the affairs of the slave market, since it could not be legalized. The duchess looked at the emperor in surprise and said angrily that she had not intended to do this at all. The emperor said with a grin that a lie must be reasonable. He looked at her intently and said that he knew that she had participated in the auction today with the marquis, and he knew about her secret meeting with the slave trader. He looked at the duchess intently and asked how he was supposed to take this. The emperor said with a smirk on his face that she couldn't even manage a market. The duchess looked at the emperor with fury and shouted that she didn't meet with the slave trader for that. A moment later, she coughed heavily, and the emperor looked at her intently. The duchess, in turn, looked at the emperor. She saw his fierce expression and knew that he would not believe her. She looked at him intently and said that he could continue to watch if he didn't believe her. He looked at her with surprise and anger and asked if she was serious. She understood that it would be better this way since she could move freely. She understood that the emperor's decision would allow her to be more free. She looked at the emperor intently and said that she just wanted to prove it and might even go to the interrogation, but a moment later her head started spinning and she fell to the floor. The emperor was shocked as he did not expect to see something like this. He rushed to her with lightning speed. He screamed and called for the duchess, but all was in vain. Looking at the duchess, the doctor sighed heavily and told the emperor that she was suffering from muscle pain due to overwork. It seemed that the duchess had recently experienced severe stress. The emperor, in turn, was very angry that the duchess was becoming weaker. The doctor looked at the duchess intently and asked the emperor if he should prepare the medicine. The emperor looked at the doctor intently and told him to make the medicine as quickly as possible. The duchess woke up and sighed heavily, but a moment later she realized that she was in a bed and did not understand why she was lying in it. She in turn clearly remembered how she argued with the tyrant over the slave market. She was puzzled and did not understand why her head hurt so much. She sighed heavily as she felt pain very often when she got into this body. She knew that in history it was mentioned that the duchess was quite fragile. A moment later, the emperor came closer to the duchess and pushed her. She was in shock. Falling onto the bed, she looked at the emperor in surprise as she did not understand why he was behaving this way. He looked at her intently and asked where she was going to go. She looked at the emperor in surprise and asked, puzzled, what he was doing here. The emperor looked at the young lady closely and said that this was his room. With lightning speed, she wrapped herself in a blanket and moved away from him. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was looking like that at the man who had taken care of her all night. The duchess froze in surprise as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She stared at him and wondered if he was a tyrant who had been taking care of her all night. She could not think that he did this for her sake. She looked at him intently and wondered if there was any reason to thank him. The emperor sighed heavily and told her to stop looking at him like that already. Turning his gaze away from the duchess, he said he admitted he had been wrong yesterday. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The emperor looked at his companion and said that they could simply get rid of the slave market. She looked at the emperor in surprise and asked in bewilderment if he would really do this. Irina thanked him with a smile for agreeing to cooperate with her. The emperor, in turn, froze in place as he was struck by her radiant smile. The duchess looked at the emperor and said that the market is run by a subject of Estland, and his name is Paus. He sells ordinary people who live near the border. The emperor looked at her and said that the dowager empress must be behind all this. The duchess looked at him in surprise and asked how he figured it out so quickly. Irina, in turn, tried to hide it to avoid serious conflicts in the future. Carden asked with a smirk, "Isn't it obvious since a simple foreigner boldly planned something like this without any support?" She looked at the emperor intently, as she had previously thought that he only cared about women and alcohol, but he was quite perceptive. She knew that people died if they suddenly changed. She wondered if his end was near. He looked at her intently and asked how he should respond to her rudeness. She asked him for forgiveness. With a smile, she said that she would send people to assess the scale of the market and collect information about where ordinary people were sent, but also find out which of the nobles were involved in all this. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she was a duchess. You can always rely on her in such matters. The duchess, in turn, froze in shock as she did not understand why he was looking at her like that. She thought in turn that he was probably looking forward to their next night. A moment later, she said that if she thought about it that way last time, she had promised to find a concubine who would win his heart. She said that she thought she had found a suitable candidate for him. The emperor said angrily that there was no need for that. A moment later he remembered what the doctor had told him, that it was better for the duchess not to lose consciousness and to avoid mental strain. He looked at her angrily and said that she could do what she thought best. Sometime later, the duchess met a new concubine. She looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she was simply perfect. The duchess, looking at the young lady, said that now they had to choose a day for the great event. The young lady thought for a moment and, looking at the duchess, asked what would happen if she too was thrown out. On the first night, the duchess puzzledly told the lady that she did not need to worry about such a thing, since it happened because she did not teach the lady etiquette. The duchess told the lady that she had found the most famous teacher for her. Once she finished her training, no one would dare to lecture her. The young lady thanked the duchess as she had tried so hard for her. The lady looked at the duchess intently and said that even she, the duchess, secretly sympathized with His Majesty. The duchess looked at the young lady in surprise, as she did not understand what she was talking about. The lady told the duchess that everything was fine and there was no need to hide. She said that she understood everything as she herself had been in a similar situation, and she was now even more grateful to her. She thanked the duchess for sincerely supporting her. The lady looked at the duchess intently and said with a smile that if she could help her in any way, the duchess could only say so as to thank her for the help she had given her. The duchess looked at her in bewilderment. She was confused and didn't understand what kind of ridiculous situation this was now. She wondered why she had a bad feeling. Sometime later, the duchess was pacing nervously in her office. Eden looked at the duchess with puzzlement and surprise and asked what she was worried about. The duchess sighed heavily and said that she was just very worried about the young lady. He looked at her closely and said that he understood, since she had said earlier that today was the day of the meeting with the emperor. He told the duchess that she should not worry since she had prepared everything perfectly. The duchess said she hoped so too, but unfortunately she had already had a bad experience. A moment later, the emperor entered their office and looked at the young people with a grin. He asked what kind of experience she had. The young lady looked at the emperor in surprise as she did not expect to see him. She looked at him intently and asked him, puzzled, why he was here, and she also wanted to know what was wrong with the young lady. He looked at her intently and asked if she was really talking about the marquis's daughter now. The emperor looked at the duchess intently and said with a grin that he was sorry to report it, but she had failed again. The emperor looked intently at the duchess and said that the marquis's daughter was as stupid as a cork. The duchess was shocked by the emperor's statement. She knew that the young lady had been attending advanced etiquette classes for the past few days, and she had mastered all the basic lessons taught to aristocrats. She endured strict and thorough training from the most severe teachers in the capital. The duchess was shocked and could not believe that the emperor called such a beautiful lady stupid. A moment later, the duchess laughed, looking at the emperor. She said that the marquis's daughter had mastered everything concerning etiquette. She was an aristocrat who had received nothing but praise from everyone. She looked at the emperor and asked what exactly made him think of her in such a way. He looked at her closely and said with a grin that he had asked her opinion on the options for improving the imperial tax policy and diplomacy, but the answer had not satisfied him. The duchess was shocked. She looked at the emperor intently and asked with fury who would come up with something like that. On the very first night, she shouted that of course the young lady would not be able to answer. He looked at the duchess intently and asked what the problem was with the empire's tax system and the likely measures to improve it. She looked at him intently and said that with the high tax burden, it was difficult for the empire's residents to engage in free activity and a gradual reduction in income tax rates was necessary. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she had answered this question. Irina, in turn, did not want to die prematurely. For this reason, she carefully studied all the materials left by the duchess, but she of course could not tell him this. She looked at him intently and said that she had studied it because she had wanted to be a duchess since she was a little girl. He came closer to her and said that maybe it was so, but she had not received any education for this. She looked at him in surprise as she had not expected to hear something like that. It seemed to her that he was saying this with such confidence as if he knew how the duchess had grown up. She looked at the emperor intently and wondered if they were not simple aristocrats. He looked at the duchess intently and said that she should thank the young lady and send her away. The duchess looked at everyone present and said that as a result, the interests of the emperor had sharply diverged from those of the young lady, and they had been unable to find common topics for conversation. She sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, it had been decided not to accept the marquis's daughter as His Majesty's concubine. The duchess, in turn, saw how the marquess was drilling her with his intent gaze. She expected him to lose his temper, but surprisingly, he was calm. She knew that, as promised, all the prisoners had been sent away, so if he had a conscience, he would not say anything. The emperor looked at the duchess intently and said with a grin that she should still choose her words more carefully. She looked at him in surprise. She was furious since she had already chosen her words with the utmost care. She hoped that he wouldn't say that the young lady was stupid. The emperor looked at everyone present and said that the reason why the young lady couldn't become his concubine was because she was incredibly stupid. The duchess was shocked. She simply could not believe that he said that she felt very sorry for the young lady, because she did not know how she would look in the eyes of others now. The duchess said in a puzzled tone that the emperor was dissatisfied with the lady's answer regarding the tax reform policy. The reason may be that the emperor has extremely high standards for intelligence. She asked what could possibly compare to the emperor's knowledge, which was deeper than the ocean and higher than the sky. The emperor looked at the duchess intently and said with a grin that he had not thought that she thought so highly of him. She was furious, but said nothing. Irina knew that every time she fell asleep, she imagined that the day would come when she could punch him in the face. The man looked at the duchess intently and said that she had no need to blame herself. They said that they knew how hard she had worked all this time. The man looked at her intently and said that His Majesty was an exceptional person by nature, so they could just forget about it. They all said that they were completely on the duchess's side. The duchess was very much surprised, as she had not expected to hear such a thing, and she wondered what this sudden consolation was. She looked closely at us, who had cleaned up, and thanked them with a smile. She said that she was very grateful to them for their words because I felt much lighter. The man looked at the duchess and said that he also had a daughter. The duchess asked with a smile if the young lady could possibly be interested in becoming a candidate to become the emperor's concubine. The man was shocked. He looked at the duchess and asked how she could say such a thing. The duchess looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The man said that he had actually heard of Lady Renoa. The duchess asked in surprise what happened to the lady. The man looked at her intently and said that it turned out that she had not yet heard the latest news, since recently at the countess's residence, he heard that proposals of marriage to ladies were flowing like a river every day. The man looked at the duchess intently and said that he meant that the proposals were flying non-stop, and that it was all thanks to the duchess's special training. The duchess looked at those present in surprise and asked what they were talking about. A moment later, they pounced on the duchess and began to bombard her with questions and requests. They said that the support of the wife and were impressed that the young lady worked hard until the last, and the floor knew that she no longer had the opportunity to be a candidate for a concubine. The duchess, in turn, knew that this was all because Lady Trouvé felt injustice and was telling off her mentor. A moment later, the man looked at the duchess and said that she should consider his offer. The woman blocked his path and said that she was first in line. A moment later, the duchess froze in place as she saw a truly terrible picture. She was puzzled as she could not believe that aristocrats were quarreling among themselves. She decided to leave their company quickly. The aristocrats called her, but it was all in vain. Aiden looked at the duchess and asked if she was taking pigeons with her on the journey. The duchess said that of course they would go with her. He looked closely at the duchess and asked if he could know where she was going. The young lady said that she was going to the duchy. She said that it seemed to her that it had been empty for a very long time. She looked closely at the emperor and asked permission to visit the residence of the duchy. He looked at her in surprise and asked what kind of tricks she was up to next. She smiled and said that now everything would be done without tricks. The duchess looked intently at the emperor and said with a smile that she was the owner of the residence and she had not been there for a long time before her release, and it seemed to her that the residence needed some maintenance. The duchess in turn understood that in this way she would be able to avoid some annoying tasks. She was puzzled by the fact that all the aristocrats insisted that she train their daughters. Eden looked closely at the duchess and said that he really wanted to go with her. He looked at her intently and said that he would always protect her. The young lady froze in surprise as she looked at Eden, as she didn't expect to hear something like that. She understood that now that she had shown him kindness and he no longer had a reason to harm her, she wondered if there was anyone else other than him who could protect her. The duchess looked at him intently and said that he could not go with her as he had to stay at the palace and had to inform her of news from the palace. He bowed sadly and said that he would obey her. She knew she couldn't take him with her to the duchess's estate, as she was sure there must be information about Eleanor there, but a moment later the duchess left, and Eden stared after her. Eden in turn felt that someone was watching him. Turning around, he saw a raven flying away. He was very surprised. The raven in turn slowly followed the duchess and flew closer to the carriage. A moment later, he flew into the carriage. The duchess looked intently out the window. She understood that at this rate, they would only reach the estate in the evening. She looked in surprise at the cage where her birds were, for she saw that they were very worried. She did not understand why they were so worried and wondered if they were hungry. Moments later, she took the cape from the cage. She was very surprised and did not understand why there was an extra dove in the cage. She looked closely at the pigeon as it was very big. She did not understand where it came from in the cage. She looked at the bird closely, for he was not making the right sound. The duchess looked at him and asked if he was the emperor's raven. She was furious and did not understand how he got there and what strange powder was on him. She was furious because he was still pretending to be a dove. But a moment later, he still managed to fly out and flew. Irina in turn was furious because she did not understand how he dared to follow her. Some time later, she was informed that she had arrived at the estate. She was very surprised and amazed at the magnificence of the duchess's possessions. The maid looked intently at the duchess and greeted her with a smile. The head maid looked at the duchess intently and said that they had been expecting her since the announcement of her arrival. The head maid said that in honor of her arrival, the chef had prepared a full feast. The duchess looked at the head maid and asked if she could sort out the pigeons first. The maid apologized for not having considered this option, as she knew that this was the first time the duchess had brought pigeons with her. She said that she would arrange for them as soon as possible. The young lady in turn looked intently at the servants who were bustling about carrying out her instructions. She wondered if she could find clues about the young lady without drawing unnecessary attention from the servants. The head maid looked at the duchess intently and said that for dinner today there would be mushroom soup and a light fruit salad with veal steak and pâté with caviar for the main course. The duchess was shocked by such a variety. The duchess, in turn, understood that she could not expect anything else from the best cook in the empire. She wondered if they didn't eat the same in the imperial palace. She in turn understood perfectly well that she needed pigeons in order to carry out her plan. The head maid looked at the duchess intently and asked her to wait a little before eating. A moment later, the head maid tasted the duchess's food. The young lady was shocked that the head maid herself tasted her food. She understood that the countess in turn knew about the threat of an assassination attempt. She understood that in general it is not difficult to understand that the countess is a very loyal servant. The duchess grabbed the head maid by the hand and said that she wanted to visit Eleanor now. It in turn could no longer tolerate being led by the nose. She hoped that the head maid would quickly make a decision and take her away. The head maid called the servants a moment later. The men entered the room and asked if they had been called. The head maid looked at the men intently and told them to immediately close all the doors, windows, and other doors of the estate. The head maid looked at them sharply and said that they were to order all the servants to follow the previously established routes around the house, as instructed for the next 3 hours. The head maid looked hard at the duchess and said that she would take her to Lady Eleanor at once. Sometime later, they were slowly walking along the corridors of the estate. The head maid looked at the young lady intently and smiled and told her not to worry. The movements of the servants would not be known. Now the duchess understood what the countess had been talking about earlier when she had ordered them to move in a certain way. She understood that if everyone started moving at the same time and along a strict route, even if they wanted to find them, it would be impossible. A moment later, the headmaid told her mistress that they had arrived. Entering the room, she saw a light and spacious room. The headmaid looked closely at the duchess and said that Lady Eleanor was still on the bed. The young lady in turn froze in place in shock. She looked closely at the woman lying on the bed and wondered if this was Lady Eleanor. Irina realized that the woman looked much older than in the portrait, and she could not tell that this was the emperor's mistress. She realized that she looked more like his mother. Now she realized that he knew perfectly well that she did not know about the contract. She was trembling with fear. The headmaid looked at the duchess in surprise and called her. The young lady looked at the headmaid with a frightened expression and asked her for help. She said that unfortunately she had lost all her memory. The headmaid said with annoyance that she did not know whether it was the effect of the poison or whether she had simply injured her head, but she did not remember anything except the very basics. The headmaid fell to her knees and called for her mistress. She was in shock. The duchess looked closely at the headmaid and asked if she could help her in restoring her memories. The headmaid hugged the duchess tightly and said that of course she would help her and tell her everything she knew. The duchess was a little puzzled as she felt the warmth that emanated from the countess. She had not felt something like this for a long time. She was puzzled as the countess did not know that the lady dearest to her was no longer in this world. She looked at the duchess intently and said that she was the child of a former duke and a servant. She looked at her in surprise and asked if she was an illegitimate child. The headmaid sighed heavily and said that she didn't really like that expression, but it was true. The countess was very close to the young lady's mother. She was weak and once became very ill. During that period, she became the young lady's nanny. She could not claim that she was happy, but they spent quiet days. When the young lady was 5 years old, the duke was discovered to be infertile. He was an extremely greedy man and tried to turn his abandoned daughter into a crown princess, wanting to manipulate the heirs as he wished. The headmaid said that at first she was happy that the lady was recognized as the duke's daughter, and she hoped that the young lady could enjoy the life of the duke's daughter. She looked at the young lady intently and said that unfortunately she soon realized that her expectations would not be met. The headmaid said that she thought over and over again that she should have taken her and run away, but unfortunately she didn't. The headmaid looked at the duchess and said that Lady Eleanor really valued her very much, and one of the reasons was how well they got along with the current emperor. The headmaid sighed heavily and said that after Cardan's departure, her ladyship had become very rarely present at the palace, and she had more obligations, and she had completely stopped seeing Lady Eleanor. The headmaid looked at the young lady and said that she had once taken Lady Eleanor with her when she was clinging to life with great difficulty, and they had visited all the best doctors, but no one had promised anything, and in the midst of all this, the lady had asked them to light some candles. The headmaid looked at the duchess and said that the candles from the temple actually belonged to her. Opening the chest of candles, she said that they were the lady's true candles, and the dying candle belonged to Lady Eleanor. The duchess froze in shock. She looked intently at the headmaid, asking in a trembling voice if she had given any other instructions when she accompanied Eleanor. The headmaid said that it was so, and she had said earlier that if her ladyship's candle went out, then Lady Eleanor must be killed. The young lady was shocked, as everything now immediately fell into place. Now she understood why the emperor was like a puppet of Lady Vallow. Now she understood perfectly why he tried so hard to save the duchess despite his hatred for her. The emperor knew that if the duchess died, he would lose his own mother. She was shocked because the duchess had put Eleanor's life on the line in the contract, and now she understood why the duchess could twist the emperor around her finger as she wished. A moment later, she stopped and shouted. She told the emperor that she knew he was here. She shouted that she had come here to talk to him about Lady Eleanor. A moment later, the emperor emerged from the descendants and said that he heard, and there was no need to shout about it so loudly. She looked at the emperor intently and said that as he already knew, she had not had all her memory for several months. The emperor in turn looked intently at the young lady but said nothing. She looked at him intently and said that only today she remembered about the contract. The emperor was surprised. He looked at her with fury. But she said that the lady was safe. She looked at the emperor intently and said that she wanted him to make a new contract with her. The emperor, in turn, froze in shock. He was furious at the duchess's impudence. With lightning speed, he rushed towards the duchess. She was shocked as she did not expect this. He looked at her with fury and hatred and said that she should not create new problems for him. She knew that this was indeed so, since only a madman would believe the duchess. She looked at him intently, but did not answer. She looked at the emperor intently and said that she was no longer going to rule him. The emperor froze in place from the silk. She said that she would stop threatening for her own benefit. A moment later, he released her, and looking at her intently asked if she would give him back his mother. Irina looked at the emperor intently, breathing deeply, and said that unfortunately, that was not the case. He was very angry. The duchess said, looking at the emperor, that instead she promised that his mother would be safe. She said that Eleanor would be fine as long as she lived. He looked at her with fury and asked how he could trust her. Without taking her gaze off the emperor, she said that he had no other choice. She said that even if she had lost her memory, she was still a duchess. She looked at him intently and asked if he really thought he could save Eleanor from her. Irina looked at the emperor and said that the only way to guarantee her safety was to accept her offer. The emperor, in turn, looked at the duchess with fury and said that everything was correct, and that was how a duchess should be. The head maid looked at her mistress and said that she had been gone for so long, she could have stayed longer. The duchess looked at her and said that unfortunately she had no such plans. She came closer to the head maid and quietly told her to take care of Lady Eleanor as she had high hopes for her. The head maid was surprised by such a request. A moment later, looking at her mistress, she told her not to worry and wished her a good journey. Irina sighed heavily as she was very tired. A moment later, she saw the emperor slowly getting into the carriage. He looked at her intently and said that he also needed to go to the palace, and for that reason he would go with her. She looked at him intently and said that of course they would do so, and also asked him to make himself comfortable. The duchess in her turn was very much puzzled, for she had thought that she would be able to rest on the way, but apparently not fate. The emperor looked closely at the duchess who was sleeping in the carriage, and he noticed that she was having a nightmare. Carden was furious as he saw that the duchess was only getting worse. He thought back to the words she had spoken to him that night. He knew the old duchess would never have said such a thing. He wondered if he should believe that she had changed. He sighed heavily and told himself that he shouldn't do this, since she was probably trying to deceive him again. He looked at the duchess in surprise as she was crying and saying that it was all her fault she was asking someone for forgiveness. The emperor was in shock. He automatically reached out to her to calm her down and froze in place, realizing what he had almost done. He looked at his hand in shock and wondered what he had just wanted to do. He wondered if he had reached out to wipe away tears. He knew that this was a scheming woman. A moment later, the emperor with the speed of lightning flew out of the carriage. At the same time, the duchess woke up and looked at the door in surprise. She was in shock because she did not understand where he suddenly ran off to. She shouted and asked where he went. She shouted after him that they were still far from the palace. The duchess was confused and did not understand why he jumped out of the carriage so slowly. Turning around, she saw that he had left the chest with the candle. The emperor fled in haste. He was furious with himself because he thought that he had definitely gone mad. He understood that everything happened because they were in a small carriage together. He knew that all her actions irritated him incredibly. Irina ran after the emperor in a hurry. She shouted to him to wait a minute. Time in her hands, she carried to the box where the candle was. The emperor turned around in anger and shouted at her to stop and not take another step. The young lady froze in place in shock. She looked at him in surprise and timidly asked for forgiveness, saying that he had forgotten the box. The duchess gave the emperor a smile and asked if their contract was still valid. Carden looked at her sharply and said that the contract was valid, so she had to fulfill the terms. He came closer to her and angrily told her not to provoke him to kill her, even if it would deprive him of his mother. With a smirk, he said that no matter what, she should be alive. He asked with a sly smile if she agreed with this. The duchess, in turn, froze in place in shock, looking after the emperor. She was surprised by the words he said to her, as it seemed to her that she had heard them somewhere before. She was suddenly flooded with memories of holding the lady in her arms and crying bitterly, being told that she had to live no matter what the lady told her, that she had no doubt that she would succeed. The duchess was in shock. as she did not understand what kind of memories had suddenly come over her. She froze in place, looking into the distance. She was puzzled and did not understand what she had just seen. Sometime later, she finally arrived at the imperial palace. Aiden looked at the Duchess intently and said that she was finally back. He looked at her in surprise as he was very worried and agitated. He came closer to her and asked where she got the wound on her neck. He was very excited and asked when she had managed to get hurt. The Duchess hesitated timidly and said that someone had almost torn her head off. Eden looked at the Duchess in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She looked at him with a smile and said that she was fine and he didn't need to worry. He in turn shouted at her not to joke like that. Eden looked at the Duchess intently and asked if she had been attacked even in the residence. He shouted that for this reason he wanted to go with her in order to protect her. He came closer to her and said that on the day she left, he saw a raven watching her. He tenderly touched her neck and asked if the scratches on her neck were the work of His Majesty. The young lady in turn was very embarrassed by such closeness, and removing his hand from her neck, she said that this was not at all so and he did not need to worry since these were just trifles. He looked at her intently and said that they must go and he would immediately call a doctor. After the doctor had treated the wound, there was a knock at the door, and a moment later the Marquis entered the room. He said he had heard the Duchess had returned and had come to greet her. He looked at the Duchess in surprise and asked her in confusion if something had happened during her trip, as he had noticed a wound on her neck. She looked at him sideways and said that nothing had happened, as it had simply been an accident and nothing more. The Duchess looked closely at the Marquis and asked if she understood correctly that he had not come only to ask about her health. The Marquis sighed heavily and said that everything was correct. The Marquis said that Paws had probably noticed that he was following him. The Marquess looked closely at the Duchess and said that they were still buying slaves on her instructions. Although he behaved as usual but did not lose his vigilance, the Marquess said that he was able to find out something. Paws had grown considerably in recent times and was attracting new customers through other nobles. The Duchess in turn understood that the palace budget was quite sufficient for this. She expected that the absence of the Marquis would greatly weaken the slave market. She looked closely at the Marquis and asked if he had found out who the buyer was. The Marquis hesitated, not knowing what to answer. He said that the buyer was the Count's eldest son, and he was informed that she had often been in contact with Paws. Irina looked at him intently and said that rich villains are everywhere. The Marquis said in a trembling voice that he was not a bad guy. He left the country for a short time when he was young, and now he has returned and made a mistake by not understanding the situation. She looked at the Marquis intently and wondered if he was really protecting him as he was his son's friend. Irina looked at the Marquis intently and said with a smile that since he had been gone for a long time, he probably didn't know the laws of the Empire. She asked if he could arrange a meeting for her with the Count's son. She looked closely at the young man and said with a smile that she had heard that he had studied abroad for a long time. She said that from a young age she had also dreamed of living outside the Empire. The Duchess smiled and said that this was the reason she immediately wanted to meet him. He asked her if she really wanted to expand her knowledge and find out what was beyond the horizon. He smiled and said that she was very smart to be interested in this and contact him. He said with a smile that he never thought he would hear such a thing in his homeland. He said with a smile that he was called an ideal, both in intelligence and in appearance. The Duchess was shocked as she understood that she would have to endure this for a little while. She asked with a smile what made him return to his homeland. She said that they said he was going to start his own business. She said with a smile that with his experience studying abroad and modern views, it would definitely be a success. He smiled and said that was true, and it seemed like she had heard a lot about him. She looked closely at the young man and said that in fact she is not very good at business, and unfortunately she does not know all the details, but this innovation can radically change the entire market. He thought for a moment and said that this was true, but he still had something to add, although he was afraid that it was very personal. Howard looked at the young lady closely and said with a smirk that maybe in the future, if they became closer, he would definitely tell her everything. The Duchess was furious, but she still smiled back at him, and she in turn wondered if she should just kill him. She looked at Howard hard and said that was right because she was too impatient right now. She turned her gaze away from him and said that in truth she felt that their meeting was destiny. The young man looked at her in surprise. She gave him a radiant smile and said that during their next meeting she would like to hear more about him, since there is nothing more pleasant than hearing about a young gentleman. Some time later, the Duchess and her assistant looked intently out of the window, seeing off the young gentleman. Eden looked at the lady intently and said that she did not need to go to meetings with the young man. She looked closely at her assistant and asked with a smile if he was really suggesting that she simply seduce him. Eden was shocked by such a statement. She looked at him intently and asked if he had followed her instructions. He said that as she had ordered, he had filed the wheels of the carriage with Papara. As soon as they gave the search dog a sniff, it would pick up the scent without any problem. Irina looked at the assistant with a smile and said that it was a very good job. The young man was embarrassed by her radiant smile. She looked at him intently and asked if he could stop calling her mistress. Sometime later, they were having a nice conversation, at which time the emperor approached them. He looked at them with fury and said that they seemed to get along very well. The Duchess was surprised, as she did not expect to see him. Eden, in turn, shielded the Duchess from the emperor. The young lady froze in place, as she did not expect such a thing from him. Eden looked at the emperor with fury. He, in turn, had no intention of retreating. The emperor looked at the young man with a grin. He looked at the Duchess and asked if she really missed her lover that much. The emperor looked at them intently and said with a grin that Eden was the commanding officer of the elite guard, so he was able to quickly change according to the situation. The emperor looked at the young man with a grin and said that he had been his obedient dog back then. The emperor said that he then lent turning a blind eye to his surveillance. Cardan looked closely at the young man and said that when his master changed, he changed no less. Cardan looked at Eden with a smirk and said that he had become a fierce guard dog. Eden, in turn, was very angry. The Duchess stood between them and, looking at the emperor, asked him to stop being rude. She said that she would certainly teach Eden manners in the presence of His Majesty. The emperor looked at them with fury and said that he would tolerate such insolence now. Since the young man still serves her faithfully and truly, the emperor said that this would be the only exception. Eden looked intently at the emperor and said that he would take this into account. The Duchess was amazed at what had just happened. A moment later, she looked at the young man and said that he should leave. Eden, in turn, wanted to object, but she told him to leave quickly. He looked closely at the Duchess and at her neck, for there were visible bruises there. A moment later, he said that she should call him if anything happened to her or if she needed anything. The Duchess looked at the emperor intently and asked why a man so busy with the affairs of the empire should seek her out. The emperor looked at her closely and said that someone had said that they would oppose the slave trade market, but there were no details about it. The emperor looked closely at the Duchess and asked in surprise what kind of outfit she was wearing now. She smiled timidly and said that she had just met young Master Renoa. The emperor looked at the Duchess with fury and asked if she really wore such an outfit to meet such a bastard. She looked at him intently and asked for forgiveness for insulting His Majesty with her appearance. She asked if it really didn't suit her. She smiled and said that this outfit was nothing more than a disguise to find out more information from the heir. She said that at the next meeting she would find out everything Cardan said, that it was impossible to seduce such a libertine in such an outfit. She looked at him intently and asked why he didn't help her choose an outfit, since he knew the taste of libertines much better than she did. He looked at her intently and asked if she really meant that he had fun in this way. He thought for a moment and said that he didn't remember that. But a moment later, he gave her a beaming smile and said that he would choose her outfit. Eden sighed heavily and told the lady that he had a bad feeling. The Duchess, in turn, sighed heavily and said that she completely agreed with him. She said that since His Majesty so wished, all she had to do was obey his word. They looked intently at Madame Rosetta's dressing room. Some time later, they entered the dressing room and saw the emperor. He looked at them intently and said that they had taken so long to get there that he had already thought that she had run away. The emperor looked at the young man intently and told the Duchess that her servant was not needed and he could leave. Eden was furious, but the Duchess calmed him down. The emperor looked at the young man with fury and said that if he didn't want to go out, he could just stand in the corner like a mannequin. Eden P. looked at the emperor but didn't answer. The Duchess looked intently at the young men. She did not understand why the emperor was so fiercely bullying her assistant from that moment on. Madame looked at the emperor intently and asked with a smile if she needed to prepare payment for this lady. Cardan said, with a smile, Madame, that she should find something that would please the overseas idiot. Sometime later, the Duchess was seen showing off her exquisite and beautiful attire. Madame looked closely at the Duchess and said with a smile that she had tried to choose something suitable for a date, but not too provocative. The young lady was amazed. She knew that this was what was called the perfect dress from romantic novels. Madame looked at the Duchess and asked if she liked the dress. The Duchess smiled and said that she liked the outfit very much. Madame looked at the Duchess with a smile and said that in that case she must show it to the gentlemen, as she was interested in how they would appreciate it. A moment later, the Duchess came out to the young people. She looked at them intently with a smile on her face. The young men, in turn, froze in shock looking at the beautiful young lady. Eden looked closely at the Duchess and said with a smile that the outfit suited her very well and was much better than he could have imagined. The Emperor looked closely at the young lady and said that it was simply ugly. Eden froze in shock as he looked at the Emperor. The Emperor looked at Madame intently and asked if she thought they were going on a date. He said that if she wore such a provocative dress, she would become a victim of thieves. He said that the Duchess had enough enemies as it was, so something less flashy was needed. Madame looked closely at the Emperor and asked why she should not then entrust the choice to the gentleman. Eden turned to the Duchess as he wanted to help her. The Emperor in turn said that it would be better for the servant to remain silent in this matter. The Emperor came closer to the young lady and looked at her intently with a smile on his face. He asked with a grin whether it would not be more appropriate to entrust the choice to a man who was more experienced. Irina in turn looked at him in surprise and intently. A moment later, the young lady came out of the fitting room. She was puzzled. Looking at the Emperor, she said that she could not help but agree with his insight. She asked him in confusion if this would really suit young Renoa. The madam in turn was quietly crying on the sidelines. The Emperor looked at her intently and asked if she had not said herself that he understood the taste of this rabble better than others. Irina asked if he really thought that the monk's outfit was not suitable. He looked at her intently and said with a smirk that it was better to be more closed in order to intrigue a man. A moment later, she saw that they were staring at each other with fierce and glaring eyes. The Duchess sighed heavily as she had no idea what he was thinking. Eden looked at the Duchess and said that he would detain the gentleman below and then pick up his scent with a bloodhound. He looked at the Duchess and asked if she was sure she could handle it. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if he had already forgotten that she had escaped 2 attempted murders. Eden in turn looked away from her as he was very ashamed of his actions in the past. She looked intently at the young men and said with a smile that in that case she was leaving. He looked at her intently and said that he was planning to open a new business in the coming days, and it would win the hearts of all the rich and noble who had no entertainment for themselves, and with the smallest investment, it would bring in a lot of money. The Duchess was shocked. She saw that he was overly self-confident, and she didn't even have anything to say. She understood that if she continued to listen to him, there would be no end to his speeches. The Duchess looked at him closely and said that he certainly needed a lot of people to run the business. She said that unfortunately it was very difficult to find reliable people these days. He smiled and said that she did not need to worry since he had already decided everything. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he could teach her, at which point she called him Harvey. He looked at her in confusion and said his name was Howard. The Duchess was shocked as a completely different name had slipped out of her mouth. She said with a smile that it would be nice to call each other by nicknames. He said with a smile that sounded good, and he would call her Erie. He looked at her intently and said that frankly it was not necessary to tell a lady such a thing, but he would say it anyway. Howard, smiling, looking at the Duchess, said that he did not use people. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was already doing everything alone. The young man looked at the Duchess intently and said that she was only half right. He said that he used slaves instead. He smiled and said that the slave market is working very well now, and they can deliver exactly whoever they want, and the slaves cope with the assigned role. He said that they gave him a child with different colored eyes a couple of days ago. She knew that the usual methods of catching people would not be possible now, so requests would not be easy to fulfill. She wondered if they really had so many people that they could fulfill any order. When she looked at the palace budget, too much of it was allocated to donations. She realized that they had even gotten into charity. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that if she needed anyone, she could just say so and he would get her the slaves she needed. She smiled and said that she would certainly think about his offer. The Duchess looked at him in surprise and asked how he managed to handle so many slaves. Howard looked at her and asked with a smile why he needed it. He said with a grin that they would simply die if they tried to escape. The Duchess looked at the young man in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She asked if they would just die if they tried to escape. He looked at her intently and said that it was exactly like that. The young man looked intently at the Duchess and said that the slaves were poisoned by poisonous plants. He said that every morning they get a dose of antidote so they don't die, and if they escape there will be no antidote, and they just won't be able to breathe. He looked at her intently and said that even if someone wanted to run away, they couldn't, because they really wanted to live. He came closer to her and said that unfortunately they would not be able to breathe, and for this reason he did not want such a gentle lady like her to hear such a thing. The Duchess smiled nervously and said that of course it was. She looked at him sharply and said that since he was drunk it was time for her to go. He looked at her and asked if she meant to say that he had become drunk on a couple of measly bottles of wine. He grabbed her by the hand and told her not to even think about running away. Since she had offended his honor, he said that he would not tolerate such a thing towards himself, and now he would find out who he was. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Duchess in turn screamed for him to let her go immediately. A moment later, the window broke and something flew at the young man. The Duchess froze in place in shock as she did not understand what was happening. But a moment later, she turned around and froze in place. She saw the Emperor in all his glory. The Emperor in turn looked at the young man with contempt and asked if he was alive. Irina was shocked by the Emperor's behavior, but at the same time they heard the young man let out a long groan. She looked at the Emperor with confusion and asked why he was there. He sighed heavily and said that the room was very noisy, as if someone was calling him. He said that his ears hurt from such noise. The Emperor looked at the Duchess intently and said that the young man had closed the distance between them as if he was going to cut her off, and he had come just in time. And the Duchess looked at him in bewilderment and said that this was not so since the young man was just an idiot who was trying to steal a kiss. The Emperor was shocked, froze in place, and asked if he was trying to steal the Duchess's kiss. She sighed heavily and said that all the names. She looked at him intently and said that she had something to report to him, so they needed to go back to the palace. Eden looked at those present and said that the dog followed Renoa's scent and a report was made of his movements. In addition to the entire estate in the capital, he mainly visited bars, restaurants, and casinos. The Emperor wondered if there was no place where he could place a slave market. Eden S. said that when he was there were hundreds of people around from the places he visited. It was impossible to hide so many anywhere. The Emperor said that they needed to start searching the Duchess. Looked at the Emperor intently and said that there was no need for that since she didn't know for sure yet, but she had some guesses. A moment later, the Emperor looked closely at the documents and he saw references to the Dowager Empress. Eden sighed heavily and said that it seemed to be true since his sister said that she was in the center. The Duchess said that in that case they had no reason to doubt. She looked closely at the young men and said that she would definitely get in there this week. Eden looked at the Duchess with puzzlement and worry and shouted that it was too dangerous. He asked her permission to do all the dirty work himself. She looked at him intently and refused as his face was too bright. She thought about it and said that they wouldn't be able to recognize a noblewoman of low position, and if she disguises herself correctly, then no one will guess who she really is. She said that everything should already be taken into account, that the Viscount is looking for the silver-haired one, an elf with blue eyes, and at this rate it won't be difficult for her to get into his house. Eden in turn was furious and shouted he was against such an idea. He looked intently at the Duchess and offered to sell His Majesty into slavery. The Emperor looked at the young man with fury and said that if he said that again, he would certainly kill him. He said that it would be much more effective to sell the swordmaster into slavery. The emperor looked at the young man with fury and said that he must have taken it too literally that he would ignore his behavior. The lady looked at the young men in surprise, as she was surprised by the fact that even Eden had no boundaries. The emperor thought for a moment. He said that even though her lover irritated him, he was still right. She looked at the emperor in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Carden looked closely at the young lady and said that he would be much more effective. He looked at her in surprise and asked where she would find an elf with silver hair and blue eyes. The emperor looked closely at the duchess and said that at this rate she would be found out immediately. The young lady in turn understood that what bothered her most was what was being done to the slaves. She looked at him intently and said that they wouldn't be able to determine the type of plant that was poisoning the slaves. Even if they found an antidote, the rest of the slaves would die. Irina looked at the emperor and said that she could identify the plants because she had eaten poisonous plants many times. She looked at the emperor with fury and asked what he could do. She shouted that she had already considered his option. He looked at her with fury and said that she had found in herself, plus the fact that she had eaten poisonous plants. He looked at her closely and still agreed, but still the emperor said that if it became even a little dangerous, she should give a signal. The young lady looked at the emperor in surprise. The emperor looked at her intently and said in all seriousness that it was not only her life that was in her hands. The young lady looked at the emperor intently and asked if he could slap her on the cheek. The emperor was taken aback by such a statement. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted him to hit her on the cheek. The young lady looked at him intently and said that this was so. She looked at him intently and said that she did not want to be sold immediately after entering the center, and if she had a bruise, she would be allowed to stay there until it healed. He looked at her in surprise and asked if it really meant that she had to be hit. She looked at him intently and asked if she could ask anyone to do such a thing, except him. The duchess said that her assistant would never agree. She said that the last time, just from his hand, her entire neck was covered in bruises. The emperor looked at the duchess intently and said that he had made a mistake that day. She froze in surprise, as she had not expected to hear such a thing. He sighed heavily and said that he shouldn't have behaved like that at all, and that he was truly sorry for that incident. The young lady in turn froze in embarrassment, wondering if the tyrant emperor had just apologized to her. She looked at him intently and said that it was okay. And there was nothing wrong with it. The young lady knew that from his side, she was still the villain who held his mother captive. A moment later, the emperor came closer to her and pinched her on the cheek while calling her a fool. She froze in shock, surprised. The emperor looked at the young lady intently and said that it was enough to leave a bruise on her face. She was surprised and could not utter a word. A moment later, he said that it was time for them to go. The emperor looked closely at the raven and told him to follow the duchess only unnoticed, and if there was even a hint of danger, he should immediately inform him. The children rushed about and ran races as everyone wanted to be first. The children ran up to the man and asked him for bread. At the same time, they were arguing about the line. The man looked at the children with a smile and said that there was enough bread for everyone, so they didn't need to hurry. A moment later, he saw a young lady standing near the children. The man looked at her intently and asked if she would like some bread. A moment later, she removed her hood and the man froze in place, and with tears in her eyes, she asked if she could have some bread. The man in turn looked at her with a smirk.